Yes. Thank you, then.
Okay. So thank you, Raphael, for organizing this two-day discussion of really, really interesting topics. I really enjoyed yesterday's session, and it's, and I don't know what you would call it, a narcissistic pleasure to be able to spend a little time talking about confronting evil. It's not a book, it's an element. And Cambridge University Press is very clear about the difference between an element and a book. It's short, it's intended to be punchy, it's intended to make one or two points very clearly for the purpose of thinking and reflecting and discussing. And frankly, I think for that reason, it's a perfect venue for the kind of arguments which I want to put forward here. Confronting evil in history. You might say it's kind of a simple title, but it's not simple. It's actually a very complex title because it's about confronting. And what do we mean by that? Who should do the confronting? Well, what I'm suggesting, and I guess I would confess that there's a certain amount of personal involvement in the topic for me, which is way outside my range. When I presented some of these ideas about 2 years ago at an online conference, Paul said to me, "I know Dan Little, you're not Dan Little. What have you done with him?" My approach to philosophy is generally a very, kind of, I don't know, it's cognitive. It's laying out ways of thinking and reasoning. This topic is more about moral emotions and the ways in which we as individuals, we as a discipline, we as a people confront things which are enormously unhappy and uncomfortable. The evils of the 20th century. I of course refer to the Holocaust, but I referred also to the Holodomor, the campaign of starvation against the Ukrainian peasants. Just a horrendous experience in which 4 million Ukrainian people died, probably another 2 million in other parts of the Soviet Union. The Armenian genocide so I kind of put it forward that the 20th century, it's not that evil did not occur in other times and places, but the scale, the depth, the pervasiveness of evil in the 20th century is something that we need to try to understand. And for me, confronting evil is more than having a few words of condolence or a few words of memory. Standing to your feet and jumping and saying, "Never again." That's not confronting evil. Confronting evil is trying to figure out, what does this mean? What does this mean to the mother holding her child in Metropole, or is it Metropole, Monopole? The Wendy Gross short book called The Ravine, and the photograph of the mother and her child at a shooting pit, just at the moment that she's being shot and killed. And it turns out there's a second child kind of folded into her skirt. What does it mean? What does it feel like? How did it happen? That confronting is an emotional issue as well as a cognitive issue, an historical issue. So what is involved in confronting evil? What I want to say, and the argument which I'm making here, is that we need to find the hammer. Maybe in Europe you don't have this, but break glass in case of emergency. In a big building, you can whack the glass and you can set off the fire alarm. Confronting evil requires that we break the glass and set off the alarm. It's not business as usual. It's not move to the stairway and exit the building calmly. It is a crashing, horrible human emergency. It's a century-long human emergency. And it's an emergency from which we may not recover unless we confront the evils of the 20th century seriously. Paul, I think you were part of the Krakow NPOS conference, right? I think you and I had dinner and spent some time there. That's what I'm remembering. While I was in Krakow in 2017, I made a 2-day visit to Auschwitz. And it was a very, very powerful experience for me. Not because I'd never had an interest in the Holocaust and the mass killing, but because I didn't really have a visceral engagement. And traveling to Auschwitz was very powerful for me, but powerful in a way which was stimulating also of thoughts about history and about what do we need to understand about the Holocaust. I remember one tiny little vignette coming out after hours and hours walking through Auschwitz and seeing 2 busloads of German teenagers pulling up, and they were doing Holocaust education. And as they kind of poured out of their bus, they were kind of laughing and fooling around in the way that teenagers do, probably world over. Maybe that's a cross-cultural generalization. But I was thinking, what are they actually going to get out of this experience? Will they confront the evil of Auschwitz or not? So there's an individual side of confronting evil in history, but there's also a professional side. As a philosopher, I'm by training a philosopher and a philosopher of social science, and also a social political philosopher. My very strong impression is that philosophy, generally speaking, in the Anglophone world anyway, has not taken the Holocaust, the Holodomor, the genocides of the 20th century, has not taken them seriously. It has a vocabulary for referring to genocide, referring to totalitarianism, but it hasn't gotten to the human reality of genocide and the mass horror extended over, in the case of the Holocaust, it extended over 5 years. In the case of the Holodomor, extended over 2 years, with the full engagement of totalitarian states, with the full engagement of local populations. These are facts that we just have not adequately understood, and in philosophy, we have not adequately confronted them. I do suggest in an early section, they don't have chapters in Elements, they have sections. In an early section, I suggest that there's kind of a predisposition we in philosophy have to look at the world as being a kind of a rational place, and in some sense, a benevolent place, a place which is heading towards better outcomes, progressive outcomes, more just outcomes. And yet what the 20th century tells us is there is no necessity of progress. There is no necessity of good outcomes. There's no necessity of rational progress towards a better world. If we are to have a better world, we have to create it. We have to grab it with our own hands. We need to break the glass and pull the emergency cord and stop the bus. The book is also, or the element is also intended as a philosophy of history, because I think that it's really key that we should understand the heterogeneous history which went into the Holodomor, which went into the Shoah, which went into the mass genocides of the 20th century. We do most honor to the victims of the Holocaust and the Holodomor by studying carefully the trajectories which led to mass starvation in Ukraine, mass killing pits in Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine, the concentration camps and the death camps. It is crucial that historians should do the really hard work of kind of pulling apart that complicated history, that heterogeneous history. So there's a place for philosophy of history in confronting evil in history, and that's kind of the second main theme in the course. Or sorry, I say in the course because I've been also teaching a seminar of the same subject, and it's the most challenging and wonderful seminar to teach. I feel like both the students and I have gotten so much out of it. But the idea that I have in mind, it's a ridiculously ambitious idea. I don't mean ambitious for my own efforts, but ambitious for us as a civilization, that we must transform ourselves. Within philosophy, we must think differently about human nature and culture and living in peace together, the problem of hate, the problem of division, the problem of totalitarianism. the transformation is needed, not progress. Progress is too weak a word. I think in the final section of the book, I refer to the idea we need to sort of have a nervous breakdown. We need to come to understand our current way of understanding humanity, culture, the world, and our past is completely inadequate. We have to rethink human nature and human relationships in a very profound way. We need to, as I put it here, rethink the basis of human relations and to recognize that the strands of hate which led to, whether it's Stalin's hatred of the kulaks or Hitler's hatred of the Jews, or Stefan Bandera's willingness to kill both Jews and Poles, that those hatreds had their origin, or at least a big piece of their origin, in differences across humanity, which are in our nature. We will always have those differences. And so if we can't make better sense of how to have a harmonious society, which is not homogeneous, which is not religiously homogeneous, not racially homogeneous, not homogeneous about many of our values, if we can't figure that out, then we are doomed to more evil. And the slogan, "Never again," is just a hollow, empty slogan. I do mention here the laboratory of hate, which is going on in the state of Florida today in the United States, Florida especially, but Texas and many other parts of the American South, the rhetoric and the laws being passed about transgender people, it is so reminiscent to me of slogans against Jews in the 1930s, that these are not human beings. They can be treated in any way you want. You can deny them access to a bathroom. What? That's insane. That is Nazi-style thinking wrapped up in an ideology of, quote, anti-woke. We talk frequently about the governor of Florida when I teach this course. So what about philosophy? Why is philosophy important? If you thought that philosophy was really just A.J. Ayer and, I don't know, some of the boring and methodical philosophers of 20th century analytic philosophy, then you might say, philosophy isn't really all that important. But I am now taking a broader conception of what philosophy can do for us. And it's not what happened in the past century in my case, analytic philosophy. It's what has transpired since Socrates or since Anaximander. It's a very long fabric of thinking about what is how do human lives acquire meaning? How should human beings live in peace together? Philosophy thinks about those biggest problems. And for 1,000 years, philosophers have tried to answer those questions, or at least make contributions to those questions. I also note in the book that we philosophers, whether it's today or in the 18th century, we also brought lots and lots of racism and colonialism and a kind of easy racial superiority into our thinking. And so to confront evil is to pay attention to those assumptions of racial superiority, which can be identified in Kant, for example. But I mentioned a few minutes ago that the idea that philosophy is often premised on an assumption of rationality and benevolence, but I think we can kind of see when we read even a medium level of intensity about the 20th century, that there are terrible, terrible alternatives, which are very different from the philosophical ideals that we have. They are states governed by instrumentally rational, evil figures who are perfectly happy to eliminate the liberties and destroy the lives of the people whom they govern, Stalin or possibly DeSantis, and that the optimism that philosophy often has had is really misplaced. We must struggle in order to make that optimism bear fruit. I parenthetically studied with John Rawls as a PhD student and was very kind of interested in, engaged in, and in some ways at a little bit of a distance from his theory of justice. But in later years, I've come to see what an amazing silence there is in Rawls on the topic of race. Rawls never refers to race in a theory of justice. And yet Princeton, New Jersey is 60 miles from Newark, New Jersey. So how could it be that Rawls would not even address the issue of racial justice? It's like a huge blank. I made that comment at a lecture I gave at a law school in Bangalore a number of years ago, and the student said to me in a very challenging way, she said, well, you say that about Rawls, but everybody loves Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen never talks about caste. So this is not just a problem of American educated philosophers. Amartya Sen has very much the same limitation. Okay, so I'm moving right along. I got to compress this down to about 8 minutes to get through all the rest of my slides. I have 250 slides, by the way, so just kind of settle back, get a second cup of coffee. No, I don't. It's about 10 slides. This topic is one which I have a lot of energy behind, but I'm not completely sure that I can completely justify it. It's the idea of the historicized human being. The idea that human beings, we sort of want to think that there are absolute codes of conduct, there are moral systems, whether it's Judaism or Muslim ideas of justice, or Christian ideas of justice, or Kantian ideas of acting rightly, that these are somehow independent of us and our thinking, and we should just sort of understand them and then act in that way. The view that I take is that for better or for worse, human culture is an historical product. We make our cultures. We make our cultures not necessarily deliberately, not necessarily intentionally like an engineer builds a bridge, but over a period of 100 years, over the period of 40 years of the Peloponnesian War, Athenian people created Athenian morality. So there's a kind of powerful way in which history and the history of a group folds into the thoughts, the ideologies, the morals, the ways of living with each other, even the distance that we stand from each other. Raphael and I were kind of laughing a little bit about, or maybe it was Paul, those kind of minor and not very important cultural differences, but there are lots of other kinds of cultural differences. And what I want to argue, and what I attribute to Herder, is the idea that for better or for worse, there is no absolute, whether rational or theologically ordained, way of living, no universal morality which we could somehow discover. Instead, human nature and history are reciprocally intertwined, and we change over time. We are a different kind of people than we were 300 years ago. So there is, according to this line of thought, no universal basis for morality and ethics. Utilitarianism is no more rationally inevitable than Christian intolerance is rationally inevitable. Rather, they are cultural premises. And I try to square the circle of relativism by making the point, this is the point that I really can't defend very well, but it's the idea that we can actually bootstrap ourselves to a better and more harmonious society by changing the cultural values which we adhere to. And I could talk more about what I think those values might be, but it's perfectly clear that values change over time. Bear baiting was perfectly fine in the 17th century, and it is now a cruel activity that only a horrible person would involve himself in. Third point, observations about historiography. This is, as a person who's not a scholar of the Holocaust, I did a lot of reading and a lot of conversation with friends here in Ann Arbor. George Steinmetz, for example, who's a sociologist, historical sociologist of Germany. And he and I spent many hours talking about recent work on the Holocaust. And what I came to realize is that there was an assumption, which I think lots of people shared, that the Holocaust is understood. We got it. We kind of know what happened. We know what sort of why it happened. And anti-Semitism was terrible, and Hitler was a totalitarian, and it's done and done. But what I learned through conversation and reading and writing about recent work is that the history of the Holocaust is no different from the history of any other complex event. Namely, it is incomplete. And we can always find new and possibly determinatively important new aspects of the experience in question. One example maybe suffices, but that's Timothy Snyder's argument that a lot of our thinking about the Holocaust was Auschwitz-centered. It was centered on death camps. We had the survivor testimonies, we had Frankel, we had the moving testimonies of people who lived, the relatively small number of people who lived through the death camps, and that was it. It was, the Holocaust was death camps. And what Snyder demonstrated to all of us, but lots of other people did as well, but it's a change in thinking about the Holocaust, was that most of the killing was not in death camps. It was in places like Kiev and Mariupol, shootings that people walked to. They walked from their village, they walked from their city, and they were killed in vast numbers by gunfire, by beating, sometimes by mobile vans. So that reorientation of where the killing happened, that's an important reorientation. The central theme that I would want to take out of this is we can always discover new and insightful material, and we must be guided by a commitment to discovering, I don't know, what do you want to call it? Truth, discovering, we must be committed to honesty in the discoveries that we arrive at. It is sometimes said that historians should be morally neutral, and I take the view that that is preposterous. It doesn't mean that historians should tailor their findings to the progressive agenda that they have, or possibly the conservative agenda that they have. The requirement of honesty and truth is a pervasive requirement, but that doesn't mean that historians should not have moral views about the material which they are discovering. And on the topic of the Holodomor, for example, the idea that, look, I'm just telling the story, I'm not going to make moral judgments about Stalin and the Communist Party, that's preposterous in my opinion. Some of these new ideas, the people I'm thinking of are Tony Judd, Tim Snyder, Christopher Browning, Jan Gross, Thomas Kuhn. It's very confusing that he has more or less the same name as Thomas Kuhn, but the German historian of the Holocaust. Wendy Lauer, I've mentioned, John Paul Himka, Canadian historian and Ukrainist, Anna Wiligala, who I think is Polish, but she writes about Ukraine. These kind of next generation Holocaust historians are just, and also Holodomor historians, are just marvelous in their detail, their focus on kind of alternative narratives of what took place in Ukraine as opposed to Lithuania, or Lithuania as opposed to the interior of the Soviet Union. So we've kind of shifted in that way. We've shifted also to a consideration, which is the topic of this conference and a year ago, the ordinary men problem, the fact that the killers were not generally convicted, convinced Nazis. They were not ideologues, they were not raving anti-Semites who killed for the purpose of fulfilling their hateful goals about Jews. They were ordinary people. They were citizens, they were neighbors, they were villagers, and that's what we got out of Jan Gross and Christopher Browning. And then trying to figure out how is it that those ordinary people did those horrible things. That's a really crucial, huge problem. The geographical shift, which occurred as a result of Kuhn's work and also Snyder's work, moving to the idea of the bloodlands, I think that's a really important historiographic change. The idea of doing case studies, understanding better not what happened in Poland generally or what happened in Ukraine generally, but looking at specific episodes of ethnic cleansing of Poles in Ukraine, or sweeping up by the Ukrainian nationalist organization, sweeping up of Jews in the forests and killing them. Those case studies are crucially important. And a willingness to consider parallels between the genocide of the Holocaust and other examples of atrocity and genocide in the 20th century. This came up a little bit yesterday, and the question of comparison is, in my opinion, it is a legitimate question. There are some, I don't know what you call them, purists, who think that the Holocaust is completely unique. Any comparison diminishes the importance of the Holocaust and the sorrow that it represents. But I don't feel that that's correct. I think we can be very respectful to the generations of people who were harmed and the 6 million Jews, 4 million Ukrainians, the vast numbers of innocent people who were destroyed. We can give full homage and memory to them, while at the same time wanting to understand what kind of comparisons should be made between Rwanda and Poland, or between Poland and Soviet actions in the Ukraine. So I'm going to skip that slide. The objectivity and the uniqueness of the Holocaust, this is really what was at the heart of the historians' debate in the 1960s, 70s, and also a more recent debate called the comparison debate, where there was a lot of heat generated over the question, is it legitimate to compare the Holocaust to the massacres of colonialism that were performed by German, British, and French colonial powers in the 19th and early part of the 20th century? And here again, to me, an honest historian absolutely has the right to make those kind of comparisons without in any way diminishing memory and recognition and care about the Shoah. Fourth point, I know I really do have to stop shortly. Lies and mythification. This is a point that Tony Judd does such a good job of articulating, but it's the fact that we lie all the time about our histories. And the obligation of the historian is to make us stop on at least some subjects, to not do as Governor DeSantis wants to do, to sanitize the history of racism and racial violence in Florida, only tell the stories that don't make us uncomfortable. That's basically the legislative agenda of the state of Florida. And that is completely unacceptable from my point of view. That lies and mythification about the past are hugely damaging. And frankly, I refer to DeSantis, a right-wing extremist, but left organizations like the British Communist Party, which completely refused to recognize the fact of Stalin's terror against his own people and the facts of the starvation campaign in Ukraine, it shows that lies are present on all sides. Obstacles to understanding the Holocaust, I talk about these in the book, and some of it has to do with the availability of evidence and Stalin's control of probably the majority of the evidence concerning Nazi activity in what became Soviet territory. Soviet control was crucial to obfuscating what occurred during the Holocaust, but there also were kind of self-justifying narratives which were told. In France, for example, Vive la Résistance. I sometimes show the scene from the American film Casablanca, where the resistance leader, gets the whole crowd in Rick's bar to sing the Marseillaise. And I offer it as an example of a nationalist lie. Not that the resistance didn't occur, but that it's a way of retelling the story of France's engagement with the Nazi world ambitions in the 1940s, which tells a different story from what the realities were. Tell the truth. Poland is a much worse case. The laws being written about slander in Poland, the idea that it is a slander and a libel to suggest that ordinary Polish citizens committed murder against their Jewish neighbors, whether it's Jan Gross or other historians more recently, it's horrifying. Horrifying to imagine states interfering with the ability of historians to tell the truth. And lies have consequences. I mentioned here Serbia and the lies which were told along the lines of nationalistic narratives by Slobodan Milosevic. And those narratives have very powerful motivational force, leading, once again, to arrange kind of an outbreak of hostility. This is my last substantive slide. Vasily Grossman is a person I didn't know his work at all before I began doing this work. I have come to be a real, what would you call it, fanboy of Vasily Grossman as a person who lived a life of honesty. He somehow survived. Much of what he wrote in Life and Fate, a book which was never published until, 15 years after his death. It was, quote, arrested. That was his way of describing it. The manuscript was confiscated by the NKVD. But Grossman tried to tell the truth about the Holocaust, about Stalinism, about the terror, and about the Gulag in a way that I really admire. So I'm going to stop my way too long presentation. It is a congenital disqualification on my part. But here's almost the final paragraph of his essay, The Hell of Treblinka. He was the first journalist to visit Treblinka with the Red Army. Every man and woman today is duty-bound to his or her conscience, to his or her son, and to his or her mother, to their motherland and to humanity as a whole, to devote all the powers of their heart and mind to answering these questions. What is it that has given birth to racism? What can be done to prevent Nazism from ever rising again, either on this side or on the far side of the ocean? What can be done to make sure that Hitlerism is never, never in all eternity resurrected? That's a beautiful set of lines and a remarkably optimistic view, because he did seem to believe that it would be possible to avoid those horrific follow-on events. He was more optimistic, frankly, than I am. Okay, I'm sorry to have gone on so long, but that's me.
Many thanks, Dan, for your presentation. So it was a huge pleasure to listen to you, and I had the feeling of the same energy. Can you hear me? Or?
I hear you. I'm trying to find my mouse so I can take down my share.
So yes, there is the same kind of energy as in your book, and the same kind of ability to grab the important question and to put them at the center of our attention. I think it's very important. So what I suggest now, that's I wanted to just make a kind of reconstruction of the way I understood your book, because I tried to I had many objections to your book, and then I answered to them with your book. So I thought that maybe it would be interesting to start a discussion with this. And then I was thinking maybe in the order, maybe Paul could go next, because I know that you know very well the book. And after that, I thought maybe Anna, you, and Elodie, and then Matt. Is that all right? Okay, so I will share my notes so that you understand me better, because I know that I have quite an accent. So wait. Okay, so I hope you see. So I will try to not go through all my notes, but so the main idea is that I found 4 problems that you deal with in your book. So I try to just I will just analyze the 4 problems. So the first problem is the one that you finished your book with, is the practical problem of our historical future. So this is the quote of Grossman. It's what I could call Grossman's call. This very powerful quotation, and this scream, never again. We don't want that to happen again. So we don't want that our future history looks like the past history. So I think this is why your book is also so powerful, because you really make this scream or this call heard. And then at the opposite, there is a very technical problem, or a metaphysical problem of the philosophy of history. And I looked at your Stanford presentation of philosophy of history, and I was very interested in the way you present Walsh endeavor. So when he distinguishes these two kinds of history, continental and analytic. So continental, that is speculative, that tries to deal with the object of history as an object, and analytic, which tries to deal with history as historiography, so which deals with history from an epistemological point of view. And you present Walsh as trying to overcome these two this distinction, and I have the impression that you tried your book tries to do the same. So, and it's what you end your book with, this idea that of this title, Engaged Philosophy of History. And I think the Engaged Philosophy of History is a way of overcoming this distinction between two kinds of approach to history. History with a capitalized H as an antique approach, and history as historiography. So in order to understand what you do, I had to go back to very simple things. What is a practical syllogism? Because I think that it's at the background of your thinking. So we can reconstruct it like this. So I desire that X happens. If I do Y, I know that if I do Y, X will happen. And then if I desire that X happen, I should do Y. And you can have also a negative formulation. If I don't desire that X happen, and if I do Y, X will happen, then I should not do Y. So, and after that, there is we can have also an epistemic version of this practical syllogism. So if I desire that X happen, and if I learn that Y cause X, it will help me to prevent that X happens. And then I should try to learn that Y causes X, what Y would cause X. So there is also a desire for information because we have a distant goal. And then there is the philosophical level, because we don't necessarily know what kind of knowledge will help us to reach a goal. So we need to learn what to learn in order to reach a goal. And this is, I think, the philosophical level of the discussion. So we should learn what to learn to know what X cause, what Y cause X. And then if we apply this to the case of the evil in history, so there is first the Grossman's call, that is we desire that in the future it doesn't happen again. And if we learn what X cause X, or if we learn what should we learn, so then X will not happen again. And then we should learn what we should learn regarding the historical horrors. And I think that's where philosophy or your projects comes in. So I think that's what you try to tell in your book is what is history. You try to decide what historians should tell us in order for us to not so that horrors, historical horrors, don't repeat. So then I think that the main question is how to write history in order to change history. What historiography is necessary in order to change history. So then it enables you to have a prescriptive view, prescriptive attitude towards historiography, historians, but on a practical ground. The norms are not epistemic norms; they are practical norms. And it reminded me of Nietzsche projects. His question of what's the use of history for life. So I think it's the philosopher that's your close, your meta philosophy is close to Nietzsche's philosophy. So then an engaged philosophy of history should adopt a normative attitude towards historians, and it's the end of your book when you say historians must do this, their task is to do this, and so on. So, but then there is the third problem is the ontological problem of agency in history. So since your question is how to avoid evil, so we should first decide what is evil, and then you use, I think, your micro-foundationalism to define it in your book. So you say that evil is not a force unto itself. So evil is not disembodied; it's always agents, people who are creating, who are producing evil. So therefore, the conclusion here is that in order to avoid that historical evil happens again, we should investigate how to avoid that we commit evil actions. So I think this is the macro-foundational premise, and I think there is also your local methodological localism that enters into play, because how to explain an action then? So an action is the result of the confrontation of inner dispositions. So what you always use essence with brackets, and of a context. And yeah. And therefore, in order to avoid that historical evil happens again, we should avoid that past situation happen again, and that our disposition remain the same. So we have two tasks. We have to avoid that the situation are the same and that the inner dispositions are the same. So then the conclusion is that knowledge of the past should teach us what institutional change should be made in order to avoid the repetition of the same situation. And the second task is historical knowledge should be useful in order to provide a moral education of humans. And I really like your idea of moral education. It's a very important thread, I think, in your reflection. So then there are two objections, I think, to this project. So first, there is the essentialist objection. So there is nothing new under the sun. So the past teaches us our essence, but we cannot change our essence. So there is no need. We learn things from the past, but it cannot help us to change anything. And there is, on the opposite, the existentialist objection. So we can change our essence at will. There is no essence. And we can also change our condition. But as each past is the result of a free decision, we cannot learn anything from the past. We can do everything we want. Everything is possible. And it's the position of, I think, a critique that you criticize of literature.
Get it?
Do you hear me? No, because I should. I'm not finished. But do you hear me or not?
Yeah.
Okay. So then, in order to answer to these two objection, I think this is where your historicist view of human essence comes in. So we are a product of history, and therefore we can change. And so we can say it like this. So there are two aspects: institutions can change, and cultures and or inner dispositions can change, because we are the products of a culture. So then against the existentialist objection, we have essences, but against the essentialist objection, these essences, they are historically contingent on culture. But then there is a problem, because the two premises, historicism and macro-foundationalism, it seems incompatible. So I thought I got you when I had this idea, but actually I think you have a pretty good response. That's in your book, and also in your general social ontology, you go beyond this opposition between holism and individualism. So I can reconstruct it like this, but I think there are many ways to say it. So the actions are the result of the confrontation of our inner disposition and of our situations. Our essences are the result of our education. Education takes place in a culture and institutional context, and our culture and institution are the result of our actions. So there is a circularity, but it's not a vicious circularity, because it's a temporal circularity. So then the idea is that we can have, you present an ontology that enables us to think how we could change ourselves by changing the culture. And then the question remains, the last question: how can historiography help us to reach this goal? So this is the first problem, the methodological problem of historiography. And I think here there is a problem, because you don't want to go postmodern. You don't want to say that we need to have the kind of narrative we need in order to reach a moral goal. So this gives a problem, because at first you say that we need that historians help us to educate ourselves morally and to change ourselves. So there is a moral function of history, but at the same time, you're very clear on that. The most fundamental commitment of historian is to discovering the truth about horrible. So there is really this commitment to truth, to telling the truth. You're not a post-truth or something like this. So then there is also a difficulty there was also a difficulty for me to understand how you reconciliate these two methodological aspects of your view of historiography. And I think you have several responses actually in your book. So I found 5. So first, I think your opposition to people who rewrite history, who try to diffuse ignorance, it gives a reason why, and to show that these people, they are also evil people. It gives a reason why just telling the truth is already trying to help history to progress. Just doing that is already actually a moral commitment. So I think this is the first reason. Also in the moral education aspect of reading horrors, for me it was really I really had trouble. I really struggle with the idea that you said that reading horrors helps us becoming better. It was really difficult for me to. So I think you give a good. There is a quote where you give a response. So it helps the readers of the history of the Nazi state. The readers of the history of the Nazi state can gain much more articulate understanding of where they wish to stand in the event of the future. So I think it's very true, and I think that all of us, when we read this, we think, oh, what are my features? What are the features of my character that would lead me to do bad things if I were in this situation? So I think that the counterfactual imagination is very important, and I think that it's true that when we read horrors, it has an effect on our everyday life, and we think, oh, I shouldn't do that and I shouldn't do this, because in case there would be a problem, I would behave badly. I think so. Yeah, I think this is the same idea that I just noted, but you quote another idea. It's the one I wanted to quote from Martha Nussbaum. That's confronting with history, with narratives of history. It helps us to develop our empathy for the victims, and it makes us better persons. So I think it's and you just have to have true histories to do that. So you don't need to have post-truth narratives. And after that, I think you have also two arguments that work at the institutional aspect of your endeavor, not at on the moral education aspect of your endeavor. It's first that knowing the past, it enables us to be more aware of weak signals of cultural moral erosion, that then we know this seems to be not so dangerous, or it's not a big deal, but we know that in the past a little change, as you noticed in Florida, people can say, oh no, it's not so bad, but we know that how it starts. So it makes us more vigilant towards these small signals. And I think there is a last idea, so that's knowledge of the past, it enables us to build concrete social institutions. So then you criticize kind of the Rawlsian method, because the idea is that we need to find institutions that we need to design institutions based on the idea that in the past there were not these institutions, or institutions were lacking. As Snyder, he shows that when there is no state, people get murdered very easily. So we should avoid apartheids, to create apartheids, because it's very dangerous. So this kind of idea. So I think these are the 5 ways that you reconcile the two premises. So I had 2 questions, because then I realized, okay, everything makes sense to me, but actually I think it makes sense because it's something that is already known to me, and I think people already had this kind of ideas. So first, your idea on institutional changes, I think it's already there, because I think that the invention of new juridical categories, such as crime against humanity, genocides, new practices, universal jurisdiction, new institutions like the International Penal Courts, and also the foundation of the European Union. It was created because German and French, they said, okay, for centuries we keep fighting, and there is this revenge cycle, and then we should just make our countries so inextricable that war is not possible between us. So I think what you describe is already a kind of practical historical thinking that was already there, but maybe not among philosophers, but among politicians. I think that some politicians, they had this view, and also politicians that's conceived the curricula for studying or for museums and this kind of thing. There was, if you take the Holocaust Museum in Washington, so there is really this idea of creating moral education. So I think that what you are doing, you put into philosophy something that is in the politicians' mind or in other people's minds, and also you show us the foundations. But I have the impression that what you preconize is already there. So your work, I would take it rather as a way of reminding us why we should do what we do, because we are at a point where people are fed up. They don't understand. They don't see anymore the point of all of this. And what you tell us is we shouldn't forget about this. We shouldn't be bored. We should. It's still important, and we should keep this policy and keep this resolution. So, and then there was another. There are many points that I would like to discuss, but I don't want to say too much. And I think my main question is whether my summary of your book is correspond to what you think. So then I will just read what my second objection. So since you conclude that from the massacres, from the past massacres, current human needs to change, you presuppose that the massacres of the 20th century, they manifest the present essence of humanity, that it's still us. So if they did it, we must change. So then you presuppose historicized essence, and that I already said. But since for me, so what is strange for me is, since you want to change an essence of Americans, then you presuppose that the massacre committed in Central Europe were committed by people who have the same essence as today's Americans. But the historicist conception of our essence implies that we have nothing or not necessarily much in common with these people. And therefore so therefore, not only we don't learn anything about ourselves when we study them, but there is no need for us to change at all. And maybe the fact that we are asking the question that you're asking, it shows already that we are not in the same culture, and that we're already out of the threat of doing the same as they did. So in a way, just the fact that you write this book, it shows that our culture is already safe. I mean, it's overly optimistic, but yeah, this was my question.
Raphael, those are magnificent comments. I really appreciate these comments, and they're very rich, and they reflect a real careful reading. I just really appreciate that enormously. But let me start at the end and maybe work back a little bit. I don't for a moment think we are safe from the atrocities of the 20th century, not for a moment. I link the assault on liberal democracy with the possibility of horrendous atrocity. Because I kind of, possibly it's just being overly influenced by Timothy Snyder, but the connection between legal institutions, political institutions, and the destruction or the erosion of the norms which support those institutions, and then finally actions taken by evil people, Donald Trump's and Ron DeSantis's, and numerous other American politicians. They are enabled by the assault on political institutions and legal institutions, which gave us, I don't know if you remember the idea of guardrails, that we had guardrails. And so when Donald Trump was elected president, a lot of people were saying, well, what's the worst that can happen? We've got constitutional guardrails and a legal system, and how much harm can he do? He did enormous harm. He was, I don't want to over dramatize, except you can't over dramatize. We are on the road to fascism in the United States. Now that is a little bit over dramatized, but I don't think it's, I think it's a a reasonably fair concern to have. The erosion of support for democratic norms, for politicians willing to say, like Kerry Lake in Arizona, yes, of course I'll accept the election if it goes my way. And otherwise, I will fight it with every low response that I can make. That is not a commitment to democratic ideals. That is a fascist idea of personal political power. I think we're losing the battle against fascism in the United States, but frankly, the far right is on the ascent in many European countries as well. In France, in Germany, AfD is a scary, scary movement. And yet, what is the purpose of these far right movements? It is to press a racist agenda, a xenophobic agenda, and to cast permanent doubt on the legitimacy of democratic institutions. So the two parts of Snyder's story about how the Holocaust in Ukraine occurred, the presence of a powerful military legal, or not legal, but state authorized army and armed force on the one hand, and the complete destruction of any other institutions that would protect innocent civilians, innocent citizens against the violence of the state. Those kinds of processes, I think we can see them again. So what does that imply about these slightly more general philosophical ideas? It is that each of us should be standing up and saying, a war on transgendered people, or a war on gay people, or a war on Black people who don't know their place, that is a war on all of us. And we will not accept that. We will demonstrate in the streets. We will simply refuse to accept any further slide towards right-wing authoritarianism. So, in other words, I don't think your very last comment, we're in a completely different situation from Germans or Poles in the 1930s. I actually don't think we are. There are political tendencies underway today. Now, actually, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Do I sound like a raving lunatic on the topic of American politics? Anybody think this is a ridiculous interpretation of American politics?
I think you're right. I agree with everything you said. So it was just the definition of we, because when you talk about Trump, I refuse the we. Or when you talk about, I agree that we are going in the war, and that there is this scary movement. But you wrote this book, and you are not a crazy Republican. So the fact that you wrote this book shows that you don't need to write this book. But the question is what to do with these people, and I think that with these people, it's better. They know already about the Shoah, they know about the Holodomor. Putin, he just knows the story, and he uses it for his for doing new evil things. So I don't think that for them it works. I think that for them we need to be strong and to fight, and I think that's so. But
yeah. So you're exactly right about that. You made the point earlier in your comments about quote essences. I don't think there are cultural essences, but I do think that there are abiding group mentalities which are reproduced over time and also which change over time. And there are at least two really powerful group mentalities at work in liberal democracies today, one of which is more or less supportive of the continuation of liberal democracy and a system of law. But the other, which is growing rapidly, is xenophobic, racist, and far-right ideologues. And so fight. You said, what do we need to do? We need to not write books. We need to fight. We need to muster our forces. We need to understand we can't just stand back and say, well, this will pass. It'll be okay. If we're in a Weimar period, then we need to fight the Hitlers while we still have the power to do that. DeSantis is now going around making claims, I will wipe out the far left in this country. Is that not a scary thing for an American politician or a small d Democrat politician, a person in a democracy to say? I will wipe out a whole part of American thought, the anti-fascist part, Antifa. Antifa is a bad word in this country now, but to be anti-fascist is not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Yeah. There were so many interesting points to make. I'm sort of in the middle of your presentation. You had the, kind of the logical analysis of the syllogisms, and I just had a really minor point there, because it has to do with what can we learn from history? Can we learn and change the future? And here I'm just really very clear in thinking Timothy Snyder is the person whose example I would want to follow. He is both a truthful, honest, and penetrating historian, but he's also writing short graphic books on how to handle tyranny. The very last lesson in his book on tyranny is be as courageous as you can. 20 lessons. What he's really doing is he's, on the one hand, documenting the processes which led to mass killings in both Soviet Ukraine and Nazi-occupied Ukraine. He's documenting those processes. He's going to much more detail than some people have done, but he's also flash forwarding to the 21st century, and he's saying there are very similar processes that underway in the United States and in European countries, and we've got to stand up today, not be sort of passive and just wait and see how things come out. That's what I mean by learning from history, though, because once there are a couple of aspects to it, actually. In the short video I put together for this book for Cambridge, I used a bunch of photographs, and some photographs of the Soviet, the Holodomor, they're just horrifying, because there are dead bodies everywhere, and there's a peasant lady being evicted from her house, her pathetic little, household goods on a wheelbarrow. These are humanly touching scenes, which you can't really look at these photographs without thinking, wow, that's so much worse than I could imagine. 4 million, that's a number. 4 million people died of hunger. And the observers from the 1930s made it very clear what an excruciating murder, death by starvation is. People like Arthur Kessler and his observations passing through the Ukraine. So on the one hand, evoking pity, evoking sympathy, evoking fellow feeling, those Ukrainians whose children had the knobby little necks and heads of starving infants, they're like me, they're human beings. That's the kind of learning we can do from history. But then the other piece is a little bit more social science-y. It is Snyder's discovery that state smashing was a crucial part of the occurrence of the Shoah, and totalitarianism, the concentration of power in the NKVD and the Soviet state, was a crucial part of, in other words, institutions matter. Well, that's another lesson for us. It's not if we pay attention to institutions and we can avoid future atrocities, but we have a fighting chance. We have a better likelihood of avoiding atrocities in the future if we preserve, the legal and political and constitutional protections of a liberal democracy. That is a good buffer against political violence in mass atrocity. That's a learning we can do from history. In other words, it's not exactly a syllogism. It's not that we will never wind up committing atrocities again. In the book, I do mention a number of atrocities like the My Lai massacre, atrocities committed by Americans against, people who are not European, Vietnamese villagers. And the very similar problems arise. How could these just ordinary American soldiers do those things? Rape, murder, hunting people down and killing them with machine guns. How could My Lai have happened? That problem is it's in my lifespan. I raised that in my seminar. And I then met the parents of, there was an African-American student in my class, and he said, I never heard of My Lai. And I asked the rest of the class, I said, no, never heard of My Lai. Then I met the father of the Black student. And I said, well, if you can believe, the students in my class never heard of My Lai massacre. And he looked at me a little stunned and he said, what is that? I never heard of that either. So he was a guy in probably his 40s or 50s. What that says to me is, if you have a sanitized view of United States history, God save us, because you will think Americans don't do that kind of thing. And then you are completely unprepared for Abu Ghraib and the massacre at My Lai and other, and I don't mean that United States forces are especially prone to massacre, but they are prone to massacre, maybe not more so than any other army. And so the question of how to understand it, I realize it's a congenital, I have an Irish past. We're Blarney kind of people. But in my class in Dearborn, we have lots of immigrant students and Muslim students. And I said, it would be so interesting in this class to have somebody who could kind of tell us what an occupation army does. And a guy who had never spoken was Lebanese. And he said, well, I can speak to that because UN peacekeepers were a part of my childhood. And I'll tell you what it was like. And it wasn't that atrocities were committed, but the force, the fact of armed ability to bully, basically, of a presence on the ground of a, quote, peacekeeping force, that created an asymmetry, which was a real hardship for a Lebanese teenager. Just interesting. But once we know that, once we know a little bit about that, then maybe we're a little better prepared. I kind of speculated in the book, what would be involved in having training for US infantry troops based on the My Lai massacre and based on what was done by most of them, but also what was done by the helicopter pilot who ended the massacre. So
thank you.
There are so many interesting points that you made, Raphael. I feel kind of at fault for not responding to more of them more directly. But let me just say how much I appreciate those comments. I want to read them again, and I'll send you some thoughts as well. But it's just marvelous that you gave such attention to thinking it through. The micro-foundational idea that I hadn't even thought of that connection, but it's a valid one, because this is a kind of an agent-centered, but it's agent-centered with a twist. It's agent-centered with the understanding agents are socially situated and socially constituted. And so, like in my blog, for example, I ask, was Socrates a war criminal? Did Socrates commit atrocities? And my response is, yes, he probably did. Because he was a part of Cleon's army. He was a hoplite, and the massacre of the male survivors of Melian massacre, Milos, that was committed by hoplites. So, but then we got to ask the question, how is it that the moral beacon of Western philosophy might also be, in another description, a war criminal? And there is a little bit of a debate in classics, in kind of the literature on ancient philosophy about this, with Vlastos, for example, saying, no, not at all. No evidence that Socrates participated in that kind of mass killing. And others, more military historians, who say that's just not believable on its face. He was present, he was a hoplite, he was there voluntarily. He was involved in that violence. But the point I'm getting at is that we might say of Socrates that he too was a child of his time. To be a loyal Athenian citizen, even one who's about to be, not about, but in 30 years, killed by his fellow citizens, to be an Athenian person was to have certain moral ideas about what to do and what not to do. And we would like to go beyond those ideas, that massacring men and boys is not a legitimate act of war.
Thank you. Maybe Paul, if you.
Okay, thank you. So it occurred to me, especially after yesterday, maybe I needed to frame my own background a bit more. I was trained in philosophy of science, philosophy of social science. In European context, if you do philosophy of social science, I think that mainly implies that you're engaged with Marx and Marxism, or either pro or con. In an American context, it means you're engaged with philosophy of science, and in particular, the ghosts of Temple and Air, of a positivist conception of social science, or at least a conception of what sort of science social science is, right? If you take the natural sciences as a certain explanatory model. And this led to early debates, which led me to engagement with Stephen Luke's work, for example, on the nature of rationality. And these were sort of dominant. And don't worry, Stephen, I'm not going to ask if the Nazis are like the Zandi. But I tend to relentlessly think of problems in this area as problems of explanation. What are you trying to explain, and how are you trying to explain it? And this leads me relentlessly to try and think about the logic of explanation. Is what you're offering, to use Hempel's classic terminology, as the explanans, as the elements in the explanation. How do they connect to what you're trying to explain? And so then that's part of why, I think, I'm afraid I show up at this conference as sort of the resident grump. I was challenging Matt yesterday, saying, well, you seem to think we're not really channeling our inner Eichmann, or in danger of doing so as a result of Milgram. And, my approach was, well, really do your arguments, pointing that way. Similarly with Dan, I'm going to raise a very similar question to the question I thought I was raising to Matt. What are we trying to explain, and how are we trying to explain it? And I'll add here that a line I standardly use in lectures, I haven't put it in print, but to say that an action is irrational is to say we're not explaining it, right? Irrationality is not an explanation, right? It's a mark of a failure or an absence of explanation. Now, it occurred to me as listening to, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, Elodie's comments, right? There's a tendency to look for explanation of actions in terms of cognitive factors. And precisely what attracts me to work like Milgram's is finding an alternative route of explanation that has nothing to do with lets you sort of bracket the question of what's the cognition of the actors. And so that's why I sort of naturally make that shift. Okay, if the cognitive factors really don't seem to be, in an interesting sense, explanatory, what other sorts of factors can we bring in that are going to explain what we want to explain? And in this regard, let me cite some work, and here I'll try and lead with my chin towards Matt, so since I was perhaps a bit rough on him yesterday, and I'll bring in some work. He discussed Milgram's work, but of course, Milgram's, so to speak, partner in crime is Zimbardo. And apart from the Stanford prison experiment, a very famous series of experiments that Zimbardo was involved in, basically were concerned depersonalizations, what people would do when, right, somehow their identity was masked or unknown. And one of the famous experiments he did was to park a car near Central Park in New York and just leave it unattended. But he had a camera crew set up, and he just kind of filmed what, as it were, the fate of this car was. And what he found was, it wasn't like teenage thugs or anything. It was sort of guys dressed like they were going to Wall Street, or, you know, an exec, you know, coats and ties, and they'd walk by the car and they'd rip off the antenna, or they'd put their elbow through the window. And this was just one of a series of experiments that Zimbardo ran. And the suggestion was that when people thought, in effect, others weren't watching, or they weren't going to be held accountable in the usual ways, all bets were off, right? You could take an ordinary person, and they would do, right, not concentration camp guards, but they would do rather out of the ordinary things. Matt and Jason framed their book, right, with the opening story about Spencer's resignation, right? And what struck me about that, and what they don't discuss, but right, this is just kind of my own Gestalt switch, is what endlessly impressed me about the Trump administration is the next person up syndrome. No matter who resigned, no matter who was thrown out of office, there was just a ceaseless crowd of people ready to step into that role. So I worried less about, I mean, I admired Spencer. I admired all the people who stood up. But as someone with a professional interest in social theory, I was much more fascinated by how easily it was to find replacement parts for these people. So where am I going with all of this? I mentioned the Zimbardo case and the Spencer case because the default assumption for both Matt and Dan, I believe, is that these acts that they're looking at, Dan's evil acts, you know, these morally problematic situations that Milgram tries to create in his lab, that these are extraordinary. They represent some fundamental rupture in the normative order, and that this is what calls for explanation. How does the moral order, how does the usual order of things get ruptured? Here's where the glass is half empty attitude comes to the fore. It seems to me there's an equally strong, at least a strong tradition, both in philosophy and social theory, that sees society as a very fragile achievement, right? You take a more Hobbesian view. You know, why do we have the Leviathan, right? It's to keep us from each other's throats. That, you know, or think of Freud and civilization and its discontents, right? There's a very powerful tradition, right? And, you know, Dan, who's you know, my question that Dan mentioned, you know, where did Dan Little of that I knew so well ago. Dan worked, continues working, decision theory, you know, analytical Marxism, right? And one of the root assumptions there is, right, of kind of, you know, how do you explain altruism if you start with a game theoretic model, right? You try and teach people about prisoner's dilemma or something like that, but altruism, cooperation is a fragile achievement, typically from a game theoretic standpoint, rather than your starting place. So my starting place is maybe we should be less surprised than we are by these outbreaks, and what the very example of state smashing teaches us is Hobbes was right. That without constraints, society, what we take to be normal behavior, is a very tentative achievement, and social entropy perhaps is more the norm, and something we are fighting tooth and nail constantly against, with obviously very mixed success. So yeah, my framing question then, and I take it to be the same question I was pressing Matt with, but press it on Dan in a slightly different way, is why is it that the instances of mass murder aren't, as it were, sort of regression to our pre-Hobbesian state, and in that way, to be quite expected. Indeed, the rational outcome of the removal of constraints, as a lot of experimental and philosophical experimental evidence and philosophical speculation would lead us to expect, rather than some violation of a normative order, which is in fact a very tentative and fragile achievement, and something that we have to constantly work to repair and maintain. So yeah, part of my question to Dan is what really needs explanation here? Should we be as surprised as he invites us to be by these stunning violations of what we like to tell ourselves is the norm? I fear, quite frankly, that we're whistling in the dark here. That the Samantha Power's book deeply impressed me, and my worry is, and I'll conclude on this. I'll come back to this in a certain way at the conclusion of my comments. But yeah, what is it we should be worried about? What is the fragile point here? Is the fragile point these breakthroughs of mass murder, or is the fragile point actually the maintenance of some sort of order? Dan also writes, this is on the second page of his book, he says, quoting now, reflecting deeply upon the history of the Holocaust or the Holodomor, seriously and honestly, has the potential of changing our natures, making these crimes less likely in the future. Gosh, I'd like to believe that. I really would. I guess I want to ask Dan what he thinks the evidence is for that. We know, like Dan, I took the occasion to be in Krakow to visit Auschwitz, but I've also visited many of the other concentration camps and death camps. And my reaction to Auschwitz was somewhat different to Dan. I too saw the busloads of teenagers from all over Europe disembarking there. And like Dan, I worried. You see these laughing kids. I mean, they're teenagers, okay, getting off the bus at Auschwitz. It reminded me more of my visit to Disney World in Orlando than it did of going to a concentration camp, frankly. And I say this as an American Jew, right? I've relatives, I don't want to go to family history. It's not something I take lightly. That's my point. Nonetheless, I looked at this scene and I said, what are these people learning? if I want to educate people about the horrors, is this really doing the trick? And I know more generally, like Nigel, I teach a course, or I have taught a course regularly on Holocaust historiography. Right, you know, Germany, completely changed its educational system post World War II. So to me, it's partly an empirical question, right? What worked? And if we look at the rise of fascism around the world, frankly, right? Not just, sir, I'm at one with Dan on his comments on the US scene. Make no mistake about that. I would like to believe people could be educated differently. I just don't know how to do it, and I see no evidence that it's being successfully done. And the evidence that it's not is, well, just go country to country, Asia, Europe, the US. What do you see? Right? The results are hardly cheering, I think. You say, Dan, you write, this is on page 13. In short, the facts of atrocity, genocide, enslavement, and tyranny force philosophers to provide more historically situated theories of human morality, communality, and rationality. You make remarks like this throughout the book. Again, on 18, you write, rather, moral philosophy should be understood as a dialogue with the moral culture of the time and place, rather than as an attempt to discover moral certainties valid beyond human experience. And yes, again, I'm completely in agreement with your sort of historicized picture of us as our essence is to have no essence. I'm completely at home with that. But given this shared assumption between us, Dan, I have to ask you, what distinguishes your account of moral enlightenment and mere moralizing? Politically, I have no objection to anything you say. Philosophically, and here I don't mean to be channeling my inner AJ Ayer, but I am skeptical about building moral premises into the explanans. You can't confront evil by simply inserting at your convenience your moral preferences. I would like to treat the DeSantises of this world as irrational, to harken back to debates I know and Steve Lukes was fundamental in. Nigel well knows these debates about what's rational. But here's the irony that may not be apparent to the non-Americans in the group. These people, Josh Hawley, Cruz, DeSantis, are the products of the very best American educational institutions. You can't say these were like homeschooled ignoramuses who just never, heard of Darwin or something. I'm sorry, they went to Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and not just as undergraduates. Harvard, Yale, law. You look at their academic credentials; they're absolutely sterling by the best in the world. So what do you look these people in the eye and say, you're irrational? I'd love to be able to do that. But I see no evidence for being able to do that. And it raises the puzzle, at least for me, of how you confront or who or what you're confronting when you propose to confront these evils or to confront this, this insanity.
Well, could I just respond quickly to that point? Because I know that I'll forget to respond to it later. That's why it's a struggle between the current culture, both in the US and many other countries, of anti-racism a strong commitment to the idea of the equality of all human beings, the equal worth of all human beings. That's not a universal view, but it is the one that I, and I think probably all of us, adhere to. And we know that it will take real struggle to defeat the DeSantises, the Cruzes, and the Trumps, and their millions of supporters who are not anti-racist. They are actually pro-racist. They are pro-misogynist. They are pro-genderist, and they're ready to kill us.
Yeah, well,
so we got to
okay.
struggle against them. It's not that they're irrational. It's
Here
that
we are,
they have a different culture, and we must defeat their culture.
You know, magic and witchcraft among the Azandi. You know, they're starting from different assumptions, right? About the social order and what the social order ought to be. Not assumptions that either of us share, of course, but anyway, let me sort of finish up here, and it'll just sort of stoke the fires, Dan, and you know, we can go from there. So you say on 23, here's a quote. This finding about the historicity of human culture and morality is highly relevant for a consideration of the atrocities of the 20th century. It suggests the possibility that a deepening of our cultural understanding of the wrongs that occurred, the human suffering that was created in the steps of social and political change that led to these outcomes, can lead as well to a meaningful change in our moral and cultural behavior. Right. I guess I'd like to believe you that it suggests the possibility. But I want to bring up two examples here. One that you yourself obviously are aware of. You mentioned in the book. You know, Himmler's famous speech at the Wannsee conference, right? And which I assume maybe you know, those who've the Coppola film about Vietnam, where Marlon Brando basically gives that speech.
Apocalypse Now.
Pardon?
Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now, yes. And what's the essence of Himmler's speech, right? Well, we have, you know, what we're doing is difficult, but we have to be strong, right? There's no blindness on Himmler's part, as I read that, to the nature of what they're doing, right? In fact, there's not an acknowledgement, but it calls for strength, but it needs to be done. You know, similarly, you've used the example, you know, the Grossman is a survivor of Treblinka, and I confess shamefully that I haven't read that book, but I have read Gina Sterelli's classic interviews with Franz Stangl, who is the commandant at Treblinka, right? Into that Darkness, really a stunning book, right? And it takes her several hundred pages of it, you know, ongoing, you know, discussions. Stangl was imprisoned until his death in a German prison. I forget which one, it doesn't matter, I guess. But Stangl just, you know, insists almost to the end he wasn't responsible. He was the commandant, right? You know, Treblinka was a pretty small place physically. You know, it wasn't like he didn't see what was going on. This goes to point, you know, some of the results Matt was pointing to yesterday, what people see or don't see, or how they frame what they see, or whether they're forced, so to speak, to frame the situation in a certain way. And you read Sterelny's book, you know, and her interviews with Stangl and her research into his background, and you're saying, all right, why didn't he see it in a different way? Right? And at the very end of the book, this very dramatic moment, he says to her, well, I guess maybe I am responsible. Right? Decades after the fact, after hours and hours of relentless interviews with Sterelny, right? Straney. So yeah, it makes me, I guess, and this was part of the point I was pressing against Matt the other day. If we're going to take an interactionist view of these matters, and we say the morality only arises on the sort of joint acknowledgement of the participants, what do we have any leverage to say a situation has been misread? Did Stankel misread a situation? If everyone around him was nodding in agreement, like everyone around Trump, how did they misread the situation, unless you want to import into your account a prior assessment, which I took it Matt didn't want to, and I took him to task for that. I said, well, this is a tension, and similarly, I say that to Dan. So towards the end of your book, Dan, you write this on 55. This reconsideration of human nature also suggests that philosophy needs to pay a great deal of attention to educational moral development. How does a human infant develop into a moral human being? Well, gee, Dan, I know you know this. Recall the authoritarian personality, right? This was exactly the question people tried to pursue after the Second World War. Where did it get them? Where's it going to get us? What, do we have the beginnings of do we have a clue how to answer it? If it's a problem of moral education, we haven't solved it. That's straight up evident, and it's not for lack of trying, it seems, right? And I'll just end this, and I apologize if I've gone on too long. Even though I'm a self-styled analytic philosopher, one of my very favorite pieces in my teach philosophy of history is Adorno's "What Does Coming to Terms with the Past Mean?" Right? Adorno wrote this in the 50s. It wasn't translated into English right until the 80s, in light of Bitburg and Reagan's visit there. But I often just ask my students to reflect on the title, right? Because, of course, it has both a Freudian and a theory of history connotation to it. What does it mean to come to terms with the past? What does it mean to integrate the past into your self-understanding? And at least as I like to read the Adorno piece, and the question I leave for you, Dan, and not just for you. It's not as it were specific to you, but it's the question that haunts me, the question that Adorno raises there, right? He's looking at Germany in the 50s, and he said, right, newly liberated Germany, West Germany at that time. And the question he raises is, why does the yearning for fascism live on? Why is it that you offer people freedom, you offer them democracy, and they turn nostalgically to a fascist, to a totalitarian past? And I took it that, the title question that Adorno raises there, and the question that he took to heart, didn't really know how to answer, though, this answer he suggests is the answer you suggest, the only answer one I think can hope to give, namely, you try education. But the question is, what is the drive to fascism? And this is the point Raphael just made. People, it's not ignorance, right? Yes, of course, histories get sanitized, but by and large, the information is out there to be had. And yet we're confronted, confronting evil, part of what we're confronting is the indifference to what the past has shown us. And I think I'm more concerned about confronting indifference in some sense than I am about confronting evil. Done. Thank you.
Raphael, can I take just a couple of minutes and respond to Paul?
Sure. Yeah.
So, Paul, thank you for your comments, which I'd like to see. I could tell you're reading from some comments. I think I have just two specific responses. One is that I certainly don't maintain, I don't think it's in any way realistic to imagine a change of mentality for all of humanity, and we all become anti-racist and we all love one another. That's not what I'm imagining as a solution to the end of evil. What I'm imagining is a migration of a whole bunch of values, some of which have to do with Martha Nussbaum's idea of extending compassion and pity, extending the idea of understanding other human beings as living, feeling, experiencing, aspirational human beings, which supports the idea of valuing equality and diversity. Because when you recognize the reality of the other person, this is almost Levinas's view. When you recognize the reality of the other person, you also are inclined to support the idea that they have worth and they have, you should pay attention to their needs and concerns. So elevating a value of perceiving the equal worth, the equal humanity of other human beings, whether it's on race or religion or sexual and gender lines or national lines. That's the A of my picture. And by the way, the US history in that matter is kind of mixed. There's actually a very interesting study that I don't know that it's been done, but it should be done because I've witnessed it in my maturation from a young man to as my grandson would say, "Grandpa, you're very elderly." Poor child, he's so confused. The creation of a generation of people, not a whole generation, a mixed generation, some of whom fundamentally are anti-racist, some of whom fundamentally embrace, and I don't mean they embrace it because it's a doctrine, they embrace it because they care about including the moral worth of other human beings. I had a student in my office when I was chancellor. She was a Muslim student, and about 25% of our students are Muslim at UM Dearborn. And I asked her why she had chosen Dearborn to come to college. And she said, "Well, Chancellor, because I really wanted to have a more diverse experience. In my high school, I was only around Muslim students. I really wanted to see how Christian students think and Jewish students think." That was an attitude of curiosity and caring, which I thought was so powerful about some younger people. So my, back at you point is, you ask, why doesn't it work better? I ask, why does it work at all? If 40% or 50% of young people, I don't know what the percentage is, but are essentially inclusive, tolerant, open to the experience of other people, not at all concerned about homosexuality and transgender issues and so forth, if those attitudes and values of embracing the value of the other have become part of popular culture, let's figure out how to make those cookies. Let's figure out how to do that and make that, I don't know, what would you call it? That culture of humanity more widespread. So it's not that it doesn't work at all. It's that, maybe it's 40% of young people who have those values, and we'd like it to be 60%, let's say. That's A. So that has to do with changing the mentality of individual human beings. But B is the insight which comes from Snyder about state smashing and institutions. His example of Denmark is just really, really powerful because he makes the point, the Jews of Lithuania, 95% were killed. The Jews of Ukraine, maybe it was 90%. It was a vast majority of the Jews of Ukraine and Poland were killed. Each being a case of state smashing, of the abolition of the legal protections of people in Lithuania, Ukraine, and Poland. Denmark was also occupied by the Nazis. Himmler himself was responsible for getting the Danish Jews and killing them. And the Nazi effort was dramatically unsuccessful. There were Danish Jews who were killed. I think it was maybe 5,000 Danish Jews were killed, but it was a small percentage. And why is that? It's because the political institutions of the monarchy, the police, the judicial system, the courts, those institutions survived and they slowed down the effort to dispossess and hunt down and imprison and eventually kill the Jews of Denmark. So the institutional side, that's the other change I would like to see us get from studying the history of the Holocaust. It is recognizing these, sometimes small and not very dramatic changes in attitude. Donald Trump saying, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and people would still vote for me. What disrespect that has for legal and political institutions. Those small steps of disrespect for democratic institutions, institutions of rule by law, those are disastrous steps. So elevating the sense, in fact, in the other seminar I teach, Democracy and the Politics of Hate, the question I ask is, can liberal democracy generate the passion that radical right-wing populism generates? And I'm a little skeptical about that too. I don't know, maybe you and I are more likely to agree about that subject. But we need passionate defense of liberal, democratic, progressive democracy. That's a defense of institutions. And we need to recognize if we let institutions go, if we're a Florida professor of philosophy, and the state is saying, you can't teach about race because that makes some students uncomfortable, well, it's worth putting your job on the line and continuing to teach about race and taking every step you can to resist and try to undercut the legislative attempt to make the teaching of honest history of racism in America, racism in Florida, illegal. So defending the institutions, that's one of the ideas that I think should come out of a careful consideration of what happened. Resisting tyranny, resisting the Stalins of this world, whether you're on the right or the left. And the European Communist parties and the British Communist Party are absolutely at fault in the 1930s for refusing to recognize the hideous tyranny that Stalin was creating. But protecting institutions, understanding personal sacrifice in favor of institutions is absolutely needed in order to preserve the kind of world that we want to live in. So a change of mentality about human equality and a change of mentality about institutions. It's not Hobbesian because it is a recognition we need state institutions exactly to protect us against the evils of mass imprisonment, mass discrimination, mass murder, and so forth. Institutions are a huge bulwark against those outcomes. I'll draw the line there for the moment. But thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Anna?
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, this is absolutely fascinating. So I'm really delighted to be part of it. So I'll just start with the very end. So with what Daniel said about the state, it's fun. I'm coming back from a tiny conference with rather young people. I was probably the oldest person in the room. And it was about political epistemology. It was very interesting, but everybody was Foucauldian in the room. What does it mean? It means that when they hear the word state, they are just, you know, they're just getting crazy. They just cannot hear this word. So it seems that in the community that is extremely interesting, promising, super intelligent and hardworking, these people don't believe in institutions at all. So this is very interesting. They have exactly the kind of opinions that you would like to promote about, you know, indifference towards other people's sexuality, anti-racism, everything. But they don't believe in the state. So this work should be done from various perspectives. And I think that the current situation with Ukraine offers us the helpful reminder of the fact that some people are, you know, that states are or can be emancipatory, and states do not have to be, you know, bad guys, right? That there is this, and this is absolutely new, unclear, and impossible to hear by otherwise wonderful kids, right? And by kids, I mean people from 20 to 30. It's just crazy, and it's particularly interesting in the context of, let's say, decolonial studies, where at the same time they see the state as a problem and state institutions as a problem, and they support, of course, and rightfully so, you know, the struggle for independence or decolonization. But this struggle goes with the idea of wanting a state, right? So this is fascinating, and I think that there is a new. We will need to have to reread Judd, reread Snyder, and I was super happy to see Judd in your book, because I think that he's great. Okay, so one remark about also about what Paul just said. So why people turn to fascism, which is a kind of nostalgic turn towards the past. Tricky again. I don't know to what extent fascism is about the past. I think that the nostalgia that is associated to fascism is a helpful addition that is quite recent, or maybe that became equivalent, or really that goes with fascism today, but was not necessarily associated to fascism before, or I don't know, because the way that, you know, there is this novelty issue, the new man of fascism, that is not just a repetition of the romantic ideals from the past. So I think that it should be you know, taken care of, I mean, seriously, this desire of finding something new in fascism too. Yeah. And then the question is really about what are the positive, you know, what are the good things that people take out of fascism? And I think that this is the question that we don't take seriously enough. What do they get from it? Because they have to get something from it. And it's not just the feeling of unity. I think that there is some, so I don't have the answer to this, but I'm kind of writing a paper, by the way, with Polish, for a book edited by a Polish philosopher that you might know, Andrzej Leder. I will not talk about him today, but if you don't, anyway, some other opportunity will arise to talk about him. So I did a small study about homophobia. I was interested 10 years ago when in France, 12 now, when we had discussions about same-sex marriage, right? So it was 12 years ago it started, and we voted for this 10 years ago. So the wave, the wave of homophobia that emerged was really surprising. Nobody expected that. So I was just trying to study. I just sent, you know, my questionnaire to my form to people who were homophobic, and in a very friendly manner, I tried to understand, you know, what's wrong with homosexuals? What is the problem? Just, is it like your feelings about them, or why do you think they should not be, you know, whatever? And the strongest response, I expected actually the physical something physical. I just cannot stand them, whatever. No, the most present response, the response that was the most chosen, because it was, they could add the explanation, but I was suggesting some solutions. So the most chosen response was, they are going to bring the end to humanity, right? So, and again, take it seriously. What does it mean? It means that these people who are homophobic, they are trying to give themselves in the world that, they do not master anymore. They want to save this world, and since they have no means to do anything, or they, for various reasons, they don't have these means, they think that at least they are saving the world from collapse by voicing out their hatred, right? So the feeling of agentivity was my main finding for this tiny research. So I think that this is very, I think that there is something here. And for fascism, I would say again that there is this, what is worrying? What is worrying with, or what is not worrying, but what is destabilizing with democracy? So I'll just show you something. Since we are talking a bit about the US, this is something that really struck me a few years ago when I discovered that. The US started with, in plurality, unity. So you were somehow in this country, in the US, you were somehow okay with the idea that there are many values, that, many different people are around. And there was probably, I have no idea how people felt at that time, but there was probably something, and people were enthusiastic about it. Otherwise, there would not be all these revolutions and stuff here, in the US and in France. But then they get bored, because we get bored with things, and they become transparent, obviously. And the reasons of the democracy became less obvious. And then, he voted for another motto of the US, which is now "In God We Trust." So again, this goes in the same direction as my tiny study on homophobia. I think that what people are worried about in these, what lies behind fascism and what lies behind homophobia and transphobia is really the fear of plurality. It's really this. The lack of stability is something that people cannot deal with. The lack of something that I could rest upon is something that is very difficult to accept and to live with. And at some point of history, indeed, democracy, the US and in France, had this obviousness of stability, in the sense that it was something that we fought for, so there was something stable in it. And then democracy became what it really is. And I would like to just, I'll come back to this slide. But I want to, democracy became what it really is, namely, and this, I'm taking this from Cornelius Castoriadis, and I don't think that we need Herder for this. And this was like the tiny worry I had. Why do you need Herder to speak about these issues? Because Castoriadis really very nicely, when he described democracy in Greece, for him, it was really the moment when the Greeks stopped to take seriously gods, right? So once you cannot take seriously God's benevolence, you have to agree with the idea that there is no response, because there is no one to give you the response. There is no response for the fundamental normative questions about society, neither in morality nor specifically in politics. So the beginning of democracy is this, there is no response. So we have to having nothing to hope for from an afterlife or from an attentive and benevolent God, man is free to act and think in this world, right? And given the ontology or the metaphysics that was the prevalent in among Athenians at that time, the metaphysics of chaos, of disorder. So they thought that justice is something that we are going to use among them ourselves. Right? There's no God who is going to bring us justice in order to repair the injustice of the cruel world. So again, this is something that we started with as a civilization, and it didn't work. It worked for less than a century. So we needed, 2,000 years to rethink about it, to even start a conversation about it. And it's super difficult. It's crazy difficult to even to take this seriously. I mean, all Christianity was the refusal of that. 2,000 years of denial of this truth. And this is a political truth of democracy. There is no one, right? So yeah, and there is no way. This is crazy. Again, read this paper by Castoriadis. It's his best. There is no way to get episteme of political things. All you can hope for is a correct doxa, nothing more. This is impossible to understand for a developed ape that we are. I mean, because we want to have knowledge of things. And when someone, namely democracy, states as its starting point that there is no episteme and you can only hope for doxa, this is super difficult, right? I'm not saying that we should abandon democracy, quite the contrary, but we should take seriously that this is super difficult to understand. And I don't think that the education of future citizens against fascism is the education to loving one another, etc. Although, of course, it's not at all what you are saying. But I think that this is something that should be responded to when we think about the education towards politics, how to fill this gap. Okay, I'm coming back to my other slides. Yeah, this is a situation 3 days ago, from 3 days ago, right? Poland, Warsaw, the German Historical Institute in Warsaw, Jan Grabowski, whom you are quoting in your book, giving a talk about his new findings concerning Polish responsibility in some events of the Holocaust. And this is a Polish fascist, Grzegorz Braun, who just took his mic and destroyed the mic in the public space, right? It was really May 30. So the guy is obviously pro-Russian, monarchist, and again, fascist. He's a member of the Polish parliament, unfortunately, today, right? And what is interesting here is that also, I don't see them anymore on my screen because, of course, the Zoom, yeah. What you see on the right is German crimes and German responsibility, right? They remind that the Holocaust was made by Germans. The look for the quest for innocence is, of certitude and innocence is also a part of this conversation that should be taken into account. It's of course completely. I'm not. I'm showing you crazy things. I'm not. I don't think that this is true, obviously, but I'm just saying that. That this is the kind of conversations we are having now. Polish people on the upper picture, Polish people were victims, right? Just victimhood of Polishness, etc. It's underlined here. But this is all about something that you mentioned, actually rewriting history. This is something that started, I would say, so I started to saw this happening in Poland in particular, but also in Hungary and in Russia, of course. Russia have been doing that for years and we didn't see them doing this. But when Poland and Hungary started to do it like officially, to rewrite the history of these countries, I think it was like in 2018 or something. So although, yeah, again, Britain already around Brexit, they had some attempts to write the UK history as an English history. This is also quite an interesting, yeah. But here in 2018, you have this, this idea that Poland decides to write a law, to vote for a law where when you speak about the responsibility of the Polish nation in the Holocaust, you are going to face up to 3 years of prison, right? This was the idea that was put forward. But this idea was bizarrely taken up. Whatever. No, I'm not going to get into the details. This rewriting history is right now very present in Israel, right? These are the covers from before and just after the elections in Israel. These people, as you know, are open fascists, right? By the way, in a few days, if you are in Paris next week, we are going to manifest against Smotrich. Smotrich is coming to Paris, and we are going to manifest against him. So this is Smotrich and Ben Gvir in Israel. So but this is all new. It didn't happen before. So this is a small event that I made on this topic. If you want, it's online and it's recorded in 2021. Rewriting history and the politics of history. So my hypothesis here is that starting in 2015, 18, something like this, the Eastern European politicians took the lessons from the way that Germany rewrote their history, in Kohl in particular, and they started to just erase some elements in their history in a less fine manner than Germany did. Germany was successful, Poland's not. But why these countries are so clumsy? I think that several answers are in Snyder, and let's say that the reason why they are so clumsy would be their complete immaturity from institutional point of view. The countries that we are talking about, the countries where Holocaust took place physically, these countries didn't have the 19th century, right? These countries just didn't have the century where America, where France, UK, discovered what it really means to have a proper institutional liberal democracy. They just didn't have it. They didn't exist. They were under Austro-Hungarian Empire, under the Russian Empire, whatever. They were divided. They didn't have proper borders, let's say. So this makes them immature, and lack of maturity. It's also lack of genuine autonomy that involves taking responsibility for one's own actions. This is really, I'm using slightly primitive, but I don't think it's completely false, psychology to talk about these issues. I should stop, right?
No, not necessarily stop, but wrap up, because we need some time to have further discussions. Okay.
So I'll just, when Daniel was talking about transphobia, I just added this slide to completely go in his direction. I think that there is something that is going on. I mean, here, the 3 points of transphobia that you see, of course, we recognize them, right? Danger for the trans people are danger for the children, going against the wiseness of nature and acting through a powerful trans lobby. We've seen it, like, Jews were using the Christians' children blood. There is a whole anti-Semitic literature saying that the Jews are against nature in various ways. It's completely, anyway, and of course they act through a powerful lobby. This is exactly the same. It's much closer, by the way, of the anti-Semitism than of racism, which works a little bit differently. There is no overpowerful imagery behind racism, I think. Okay, so the book was absolutely great, and of course, I do have 200 slides, unlike you, right? This is how I work, unfortunately. So I was just okay. I will just say this is really 2 slides, and I'm done. 3 slides, and I'm done. You were talking about human nature, you were trying to historicize it, etc. Well, I think that the notion of human nature is not a descriptive notion. I think that it has always been a normative notion. You know, if you are a Schopenhauer and you have a conception of human nature, or Machiavelli, whatever, you have a conception of human nature not to describe what humans are, but to do something, to make a normative proposal, let's say. The same for Aristotle and Hume. They need an anthropology and to do something else. It's not for the description purposes, but I would say much more for normative purposes. So you know, since this notion have just no operational value whatsoever, I would just skip it again. And, you know, I would use, for example, people like Horkheimer, who, by the way, extreme pessimist on one hand, but there is this phrase that I really like. If you don't want to talk about capitalism, you had better keep quiet about fascism, right? It's as simple as that. We just have to figure out how come people were put in this situation, right? So why people started to behave in a certain manner? Was it due to the deployment of their nature or rationality? Well, no, because I think that they were not. So people who behave in the way that we deplore, I claim that they have been on individual or on a collective level deprived of the possibility of achieving the maturity and autonomy, and not in the sense of Kant, in the sense of being able to live by themselves with the doubts, with, you know, this kind of stuff. So they are non-autonomous and immature, and this is why they don't get it. This is why they behave as they do. It's not a failure of rationality. It's not a failure of their nature. They were just not given the chance for some reasons, for particular historical reasons in each case. They were not given the chance to become full human being. So history shows that the evil emerges as a response to humiliation, a kind of vengeance or protection, right? So even though the response is completely hilarious, ridiculous, I mean, the word evil doesn't even give justice to this. I think that what should interest us is how to think about providing people with tools to become entirely mature human being. So how can philosophy come to grips with the basic facts about individual human behavior? So this is a quote from the question from your book. So I'm saying that philosophy is not meant to deal with these issues by itself, but I know that you are adding history by yourself, of course, but I claim that these are not basic facts about individual human behavior. I think that these are complex facts about collective human behavior, development, and economical and ideological environment. Okay, I'm stopping.
Thank you.
Anna, awesome comments. I'd love to have all your slides.
Okay, with pleasure, sure.
Including the ones you weren't able to share. Oh, wonderful. Again, time, Raphael, could I go back to a question in Anna's presentation?
I think we have time.
Can you put your slides back up and go back about 3 slides? About humiliation was the comment I wanted to make. One more, 2 more. Yeah, this one. Yeah. So this last sentence, history shows that evil emerges as a response to humiliation. That's one of the reasons why I think it's valuable to do what Snyder does, which is to look at the Bloodlands, to look at both Holocaust and Holodomor, because what you describe here, at least partially, is descriptive of many events having to do with the killings of Jews in Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, and so forth. But it has almost nothing to do with the Holodomor. The Holodomor was the product of the Soviet Communist Party and of Stalin and the NKVD. It was a direct top-down political imperative to crush and destroy the Ukrainian peasant. So I would just say that this statement is overgeneralized. What do you think about that?
Okay, super interesting. But you know that Holodomor didn't happen physically. Like people were not. The idea was to take crops from to give them to the Russian people, for them to, there was this feeling of mission that it's either us or them. So each soldier who would go to one house or another in Ukrainian, countryside, they would think that they are saving the Russian nation. So I would say that this is, no, you don't think it's true?
No, I don't.
Okay.
First of all, it wasn't largely soldiers; it was NKVD.
Sure.
And secondly, it was not in any way presented. It was destroyed. It was to destroy the peasantry. They were resisting collectivization, and Stalin's express and literal intention was to use hunger as a weapon of war against the Ukrainian peasant. And I think this is well established. It's very clear in Snyder, but it's also clear in Kessler. In Kessler's simultaneous travels through Ukraine by train in whatever, 1933, 34, 35. It was a weapon of war. It was not inadvertent. It was not individual stuff. It was a political action by a totalitarian state.
No, for sure. It was orchestrated. I'm just trying to understand how they managed to make it work, because individual people had to go from house to house to do that also. So this is why I was only thinking about the individual justification of people who genuinely had to act upon it. So but otherwise, of course, you are right that it was orchestrated, for sure. Of course, I'm just writing about Lemkin and trying to, the France a few weeks ago only recognized Holodomor as a genocide. And criticisms from the left wing, by the way, very surprising. So I'm trying to explain, and I go to your direction also. I'm saying that you don't have to kill all the people to have a genocide. Genocide is not about annihilating a nation. It's about annihilating several, whatever, Lemkin, so I'm not going to get into the details, but for sure, yeah.
So,
4 billion people perished in that 18-month period. Horrifying. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
So maybe Elodie, I'm not sure whether we hear you, whether your microphone works.
Oh, you cannot hear me?
Yes. No, it's okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I will shortly sum up the book so that you can see how I understood it, maybe miss a little, so you understand where my discussion come from. So in your book, you kind of propose a whole research program, namely Confronting Evil in History. And more precisely, you claim that philosophy should tackle the problem of evil in a new way, since the philosophical canon, written mostly before the mass crimes of the 20th century, offers no resource to conceptualize evil, as these events revealed it, as radical evil or something like that. So in the second chapter of the book, you show that the philosophical canon from Plato to contemporary thinkers tends to conceive of human nature as rational and benevolent, a conception that was proved wrong by these 20th century mass crimes like Holodomor, the Holocaust, or the Nanjing rape and other genocides. So you criticize philosophy as being remained conceptual and abstract while not having confronted itself to the empirical material about human nature and evil that is to find in the events of the 20th century. But as you show, such a material was produced by historians, sociologists, and other researchers in human science about this history. So we know that evil can be massive, can be radical, and can be perpetrated by ordinary people enrolled in a totalitarian regime, or simply placed under the command of an authority aiming at the destruction of other human beings. So you review especially the material concerning the Holocaust in chapter 4, and in chapter 5, you exposes the material concerning a deficient commemoration and theoretical elaboration of this event in Western countries. As a result, in chapter 6, you claim that we have a deficient awareness of this event and of its signification about the nature of evil, as well as other atrocities of the 20th century. And this would be obvious in our culture, and this would cause some current events like Trump's destabilization of the American democracy in 2020 or the Russian war in Ukraine. So you claim that philosophy has now a role to play, a theoretical task that could influence the course of events and maybe save our democracies for some periods. So this task would be to elaborate a new conception of evil, integrating the historical events of the 20th century. So I would sum up your central argument or thesis in this way. Western philosophy has a false conception of human nature, namely as rational and benevolent, so as being intrinsically good, whereas this conception has been proven false by the atrocities of the history of the 20th century. So now philosophy must take this history into account to elaborate a new conception of human nature, integrating evil, and in that way, it could change our culture by making us aware of what the atrocities of the 20th century disclosed or changed to our nature. Then this more accurate conception of ourselves and of what we are capable of would incline us to avoid repeating these atrocities while preserving our democratic societies. Now, I would like to discuss two assumptions of this thesis. Firstly, the assumption that this research program can be scientifically achieved by a cooperation between philosophy and history. To me, we need to add some other research fields. And the second assumption I would like to discuss is that such a research program can have the sort of normative or prescriptive purpose in relation to our culture that you hope it can have. So on the first point, I believe that what is at the center of your suggested research program is not the human nature, but the nature of evil. And these two questions are, of course, related in a way that makes philosophy not able to address them without integrating the psychological sciences as well as history and other human sciences in a pluridisciplinary research program. So that's my point of view, because it is true that the philosophical canon has no satisfying conception of evil in the view of the history of the 20th century especially, and it is because the classic philosophical conception of evil is as negative as a lack of rationality or as a lack of moral force or a lack of empathy, for instance. But the history of the 20th century, with all its atrocities, mass crimes, mass killings, has demonstrated the positivity of evil. So a positivity which is roughly the ability for human beings to perpetrate crimes with no reason, no interest, only by cruelty and destructiveness. So to do evil things for themselves, to be agents of evil for its own sake, which is very different from lacking empathy or lacking moral force and everything. So now, to conceptualize this positivity of evil, we are confronted to the highly mysterious question of the origin of evil. And this question had been put aside by the traditional philosophical canon because of its negative conception of evil, since evil was conceived of as imperfection. So the matter of its origin was kind of inexistent. Whereas if evil exists positively as a destructiveness perpetrated by human beings with gratuity, then where does it come from? This is actually the hard question that the 20th century confronts us with, maybe. And now, if we want to address this question of the origin of evil, I think that we do need to combine not only philosophy and history, but also the psychological science and research field. So because this question of the origin of evil is in fact at the core of the psychological science, when they wonder, for instance, what a psychopath is, if Eichmann was a psychopath, that kind of questions. So again, I think that psychological science can be combined with history and sociology, as we can see in the work of Norbert Elias who I already quoted yesterday. So if we want to solve the question of the origin of the evil, what we need to elaborate is something about the psychological as well as the sociological and historical evolution of our essence or nature, I don't know. So that was my first suggestion. And the second point is about the normative or prescriptive aim of this research program. So I kind of doubt that this program can explicitly aim at modifying our culture by integrating a new conception of human nature or of the nature of evil, or of human nature as capable of the worst, etc. So I cannot really see how we could decide voluntarily to integrate this notion in our culture and to shape our culture by incorporating this or that concept in it. In fact, we don't really master the consequences of expliciting a concept or another. When philosophy kind of provide reflexivity on culture by explaining some concepts, some notions, in one way or another, they are already in the culture and we only make them explicit, and then it has a consequence in return on the society, the culture, and the course of history, but we cannot really master or foresee what these consequences will be. So, for instance, the categories that the philosopher can formulate about what human beings are retroact on the practices as well as they emerge from those. I think this is in the work of Jan Hacking, what I have in mind. So I was wondering whether that there really is a lack of awareness of what happened in the 20th century in our culture, as you kind of say, if I understand well what's in the book. So in chapter 6, you write that the tragedy was not absorbed, as if we wouldn't be really aware of what happened in the 20th century. And I'm just wondering, is it true? Or is it rather the opposite? Maybe Trump's assault on democracy and Russian war on Ukraine are proving the opposite, that we are well aware that we are capable of the worst. But maybe the consequence that we are drawing from that is not the right one. We are not doing what philosophers would expect us to do, and we are not trying to avoid this to happen again. We are just letting it happen again. And maybe we could explain that in many ways. For instance, we could hypothesize that our state of mind is that now, as we are aware of being capable of the worst, we are very pessimistic towards ourselves, toward our own nature, toward our own future. And for instance, if many people take no concrete action to avoid climate change, it's not because they are motivated by climato-skepticism, but also they are kind of apathic and selfish. And maybe it reflects something like a disgust of ourselves as human beings, or even self-hatred. Maybe it's just that we don't really judge ourselves worth being saved. And maybe we don't care about saving the planet and humanity because we don't think it's worth it. Because we know that we're bad in one way or another. So maybe it's precisely the awareness of the fact that these crimes are perpetrated by ordinary people that robs us of all trust and love for other human beings, including ourselves. Maybe deeply we think that we would have done the same than the murderers. So we kind of lose any hope and any trust in humanity. So I was thinking about Nietzsche's last man, the cynical. So he does not ignore or repress the knowing of what happened in human history. On the contrary, he knows everything, and that's why he winks and he asks, what is love after all? And he's not taking anything seriously anymore because, yeah, history demonstrated that it's not worth it in one way or another.
What a gloomy conclusion. Elodie, what thoughtful remarks. I hope you're willing to share them with me. I'd like to reread them, but I really enjoyed, and I took a number of notes here. I realize our director probably has some thoughts about the time, but may I just make a comment or two to Elodie? Because the thrust of your comments are kind of on the 3/4 empty side of Paul's dichotomy. The glass is 1 half empty, 1 half full. Pretty gloomy, in other words. You're doubtful that the perspective of confront history, do it as a culture, and become more just and more peaceful. That is kind of the thrust of what I'm suggesting. The truthful confronting of the realities of history, of our historical experiences, not as just one individual. I don't for a moment think that it's transformation of 310 million American citizens about racism that will lead to racial justice. Institutional change, educational change, there are dozens of vectors of causation which are needed in order to make our culture a more just one. But to have the political will, both collectively and individually, we need to know what it is we're trying to not do. And there, I think that being better acquainted with the history of terrible things is a good impetus to not doing them again. The example I would give is about teaching about racism in the United States and the history of racism. And there's a soft-tinged, romanticized story about how the US used to be racist and it used to have slavery. And thank goodness we had the early part of the civil rights movement, and now we have racial equality. So get over it, stop talking about racism, move on. You're too woke. That's the narrative that we're being told. And it is a profoundly horrible narrative because we have never confronted Tulsa, the massacre which occurred in, I don't know, I forget what year, 1910, something like that, early part of the 20th century. The massacres which occurred in towns and neighborhoods in Florida in the 1920s and 30s, the history and pattern of lynchings in the American South. We've never confronted that violent, ultra-violent history of racial domination in this country. The Foucauldian history of Jim Crow, which partly depended on violence and partly on other kinds of social norms, we haven't confronted those things because we haven't really thought about them enough. And if we were to follow the dictates of the Republican Party, we never would, because it would be illegal to teach honestly about the history of American racism and violence. It's a disturbing subject. Well, we should be disturbed. One comment that you made kind of rang a bell with me. I do believe that philosophers have not taken the Holocaust seriously. I think philosophers have just kind of, yeah, it happened. I'm aware. I'm an educated person. I know something about it, but I'm interested in philosophy of language, or I'm interested in ethics, but in a very meta-ethical. That's not good enough. Philosophy is about how we live and how we can live together. And that requires that we consider not the occurrence of the occasional pogrom in 1910 in Russia, which is why my children's great-grandparents came to the United States, but rather, so pogroms are not that hard to understand. It's institutionalized, state-sponsored murder and oppression on a massive scale. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about evil. And we can avoid those outcomes. We understand kind of clearly how fascism devours its young, kills its opponents, and enslaves and ultimately murders in the name of something, maybe the name of Aryanism, maybe in the name of socialism in our time. But the totalitarian impulses of an all-powerful state are one of the mechanisms that led to those evils. And we can understand those things. And if we don't want those things to happen, then we need to stand up to Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, and whatever the governor of Texas is called, Abbott, something like that. Anyway, I'm sorry. I realize I'm taking so much time out of this wonderful seminar. I really appreciate your thoughtful reflections. I want to read through them again. And if you don't mind, I'll send you a few comments back as well.
Sure, thank you so much. Thank you.
So there are two questions, one by Steve.
This has been so interesting, and so many different things have been said. And it just all couldn't interest me more because as it happens, I just want to mention, I've been thinking about this a lot. I've just finished a book called The Diversity of Morals with a chapter on mass atrocities. So I'm completely into this. And I want us to go back to this really very interesting dispute or disagreement between Dan and Paul on the question of basically what it is, this is how I understand it, what it is that we're trying to explain. And I'm going to ask a question which actually takes us also back to the discussion yesterday with Matt, in which Paul was raising the question of whether one should be building one's moral premises into the explanans or not. So in order to ask my question, let me tell a little anecdote, which also brings in another central participant in our discourse, namely in our discussions, namely Browning. Some years ago, quite a long time ago, I was giving a talk, actually in southern France, in Aix, on Browning, actually, on mass atrocities. And I was celebrating what I think is the triumph of that book, which actually, in a way, should be chastening to philosophers. It's this, that in the last chapter of his book, he goes through the various explanations of what the Battalion 101 did. And he's unsatisfied with all of them. And he says, basically, well, there are all these answers to the possible answer to the question, well, why did all this terrible stuff happen? Why did this small number of policemen end up responsible for I think it's 89,000 deaths or something like that? And he says, basically what he says is, I don't know, I'm just a historian, I'm doing my best. So there's this why question, why? Why did this happen? So what I said when I was giving this talk in France was, I said, actually, the why question could be a causal question. So a question to which people like Matt and social psychologists and indeed Milgram and Zimbardo and all the rest of them tried to get at answers. Or it could be another question, which is why, meaning, how could this have happened? How could that be? How could it be that this happened? Which is, in a way, the question that's lying behind, I think, the whole of Dan's book, much of which I have a lot of sympathy with. But on the other hand, I'm fascinated by the disagreement with Paul. So I gave this talk in Aix, and I said that, how could it have happened? Then a very alarming thing happened, a strange thing, which I remember to this day, which is that there was a young woman. She was Black, African woman, I guess from some Francophone country in North Africa. And she said to me, the question was, well, why shouldn't it have happened? What is that question? Why? How could it have happened? Why shouldn't it have And that is to raise this whole issue of situationism. I mean, it seems to me, I'm obviously oversimplifying, but I'm trying to get into the heart of all of this. It seems to me, Dan is asking, how could it have happened? Maybe Paul is saying, well, why shouldn't it have happened? I mean, I think Paul's general stance of, which we could call situationist, is one which basically says, look, anybody can do terrible things at any time. I mean, these are examples. He gave the example from Klemperer yesterday, and today this Zimbardo experiment with the car in New York and all the rest of it. And so I'm wondering, I mean, is that where we are, that we really are faced with this stark alternative between being puzzled by the fact that this terrible, that we're calling, and that Dan is calling evil for obvious reason. It's a puzzle because we're amazed, I mean, we're astounded by the sheer possibility of mass atrocities, or rather the actuality of them. How could this happen? That seems to me a perfectly legitimate question which we cannot but ask. To which Paul's response seems to be, well, why shouldn't it? I mean, why not just accept the fact that human beings are capable of empathy, goodness, all kinds of wonderful things, civilization that we all know about. But equally, the opposite is just as true. And so it's all down to situations. And human nature, whatever that, however we're supposed to think about that, is kind of indefinitely malleable. I don't know if I've oversimplified the disagreement between Paul and Dan, but I do think, just to make one other remark, I think there are things to say. And I'll just make two references here before I stop. One is that I do think there's a particular book which none of you have referred to, which I find strangely absent from a lot of the discussions of these issues, but I think is a wonderful book by Abraham Daswan called The Killing Compartments, in which is a very, very interesting debate or discussion of what he calls the situationist consensus, of which he's critical for, I think, very powerful reasons, which touches on what Dan called the ordinary men problem. I think the ordinary men problem, and this is what Daswan argues, is not properly formulated, because those Hamburg policemen were not ordinary men in the very general sense that we might understand it if we mean like us. They were men brought up in a particular culture at a particular time, which is the way of connecting the whole question of macro history to micro reality. And so I think Browning's title takes us too rapidly from the thought of ordinary Germans brought up in that particular historical world doing terrible things to just what any of you or I could do. I think that transition is too fast. That's one thing. That's one reference. I'm going to stop now because I forgot. Maybe I'll come back. There was a second reference I was going to make, but I'll stop there. And I just wonder if what I've just said is of any help.
Stephen, if I can quickly, and I realize briefly, respond. As always, really deeply engaging comments, and I appreciate them. The question of psychology of participants is an important question, but it's not the only important question. The discrimination which Kristen Monroe makes in her study of interviews with survivors, her distinction into genociders, bystanders, and rescuers, and her effort to understand what is it about the moral psychology of each of those groups, which led them to be active supporters, active killers, bystanders who, for a variety of reasons, maybe didn't like what they were seeing, but didn't take a stand, and then relatively small number of rescues. Those are all really interesting questions. But again, I'm not sure that they're right at the heart of the evil of the 20th century, because I think the evil of the 20th century is the state-initiated atrocities that could not have happened without state power and state organization,
I agree with that.
whether it's the Nazi state or the Soviet state. And those are the harder, well, they're the bigger question. I'm not sure they're the harder questions, but they're questions not of psychology, but of, you know, kind of administrative behavior, organizational behavior, and even military organization behavior. Why did Farben, IG Farben, I guess. Why did Farben so willingly contribute to the war efforts, including the production of poison gas? That's a question about an organization, not specifically about a bunch of individuals. So basically, I just want to broaden your question a little bit. It's not just about human nature. I always use, I think I always use scare quotes around human nature, because I don't think there is a human nature, you know, once and for all. But the kind of culturally constituted set of values and identities which govern a group of people at a time, often in conflict with another group of people. That's what I'm referring to when I speak of a historically situated human nature. And then the corollary, what about individual psychological behavior within a specific context? Those are really interesting questions, but I don't think they're right at the heart. We could have good understandings of why the ordinary men did what they did, and you know, when they got transported. They were mostly leftists, by the way, according to Browning, Stephen.
Yeah.
They weren't pro-Nazi, which you didn't assert, but I'll just remind all of us that they were more like us than they were like Eichmann. Those ordinary man questions are interesting, important questions, but I wouldn't say that they're the most important questions. The most important questions, I think, are about political institutions, state-initiated atrocity.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have a follow-up. I'm sorry, Carsten, just because Steve asked you a question, so if you want to respond.
Right. Oh, I just wondered if Paul had any response to what would Paul have said, I'd like to know, to the young woman who said to me, well, why shouldn't it happen? Would you have had an answer to her?
Oh, I think she had it right. Yeah, this is part of what I was trying to get at when I said, you know, you look for what explains the situation, and you brought up the Swan book last year at this conference, yeah. And I did take a look at it, and I'm afraid I don't share your enthusiasm for it. Of course, furious that Elodie has run to my right, flanked me on the right, and gone for the glass quarter empty rather than half empty. But yeah, I stick with the sort of causalist approach here, and I'll just mention, and I'll see if Matt wants to jump on me for this, but right, there's all this now well-known research in social psychology, you know, the famous one about the theology students leaving the lecture on Apostle Paul and running past the man, you know, lying on the steps because they've been intentionally made late for the next lecture, and you know, the busking, you know, the New York Philharmonic violinist who plays in the subway station but can't get a quarter, but he's playing in the New York Philharmonic in the house situations and people, I'm just maybe more impressed than I should be, but I'm deeply, deeply impressed by all this experimental evidence that says it doesn't really matter much what people claim their prior beliefs are. You put them in certain situations, and it's alarmingly easy to elicit contrary behaviors. And Emily isn't here today, but the interesting thing was, even though she was making this brief, this case for cross-cultural evidence, the relevant variable she brought up was, well, some cultures are even more inclined to follow orders than European cultures, right? Hardly cheering news, and hardly a strike against the situationist paradigm. So I'm sorry, Steve, I remain unapologetically committed to that. But I know Mr. Empathy here wants to jump in. So
I want to put in a parenthesis, and yet some people are rescuers. Some people do act out of integrity. So I think that refutes the idea that the situation entirely determines outcome.
It's not 100%, but you don't need 100%.
Yeah, you just need enough.
Kirsten.
Yeah, thanks. That's all very interesting. I just want to jump in and maybe point to something that I'm missing so far. I mean, there's way too much Herder and cultural relativism, and I'm missing a little bit of the universalist Kantian and Adam Smithian perspective. And I think that's important, because I think if I understand Dan rightly, he doesn't like the identity politics on the right, and who does? But in some sense, from a political point of view, you do seem to like the identity politics of the academic American campus. And I'm actually not so sure about that. I don't think anti-racism courses or workshops will help us to fight Nazism. I think we need a much more, and I see a little bit of a tension in your work. In some sense, you want to emphasize truth and objectivity. On the other hand, you emphasize, in some sense, cultural relativism. Now, I think that doesn't necessarily go together. I think you need to have some kind of perspective discourse that actually enables you to address the other side and try to ground the values from which you are talking, maybe in a more Kantian, Adam Smithian way, so that there's at least a discourse possible. Because what I see actually happening in the American context is you have no joy either on the left or the right. It's all apocalypses. It's either racism, colonialism, what do you call it? Climate, global warming, and we are all going to die. On the right, you have, it's immigration, and they all want to replace us, and we are all going to die. And so, I mean, that is not attractive to anybody, particularly to young students. I mean, when I'm actually not interested in making students think right, but make students think. And I think we should go back to the old-fashioned idea of we educate students in that respect, and the rest will hopefully follow. And I think actually one thing that you left out in fighting fascism is the fundamental mistake of the left was that they couldn't unify, right? They were unable to compromise and to develop a more universalist perspective. They all were concerned with their own identity. And I think that doesn't work. So I mean, this political statement, but also a little bit tension in terms of the epistemic of your position.
So if I could, that's a really interesting set of comments, Karsten, because I don't think I agree with your view about the way in which American universities or American society are polarized. I think there are three segments. There is the far right segment, which is racist, white supremacist, anti-gay, anti-immigrant. It's based on hate and division. There is an ultra-left point of view, which is intolerant of everyone who doesn't agree with the catechism. But there's a third possibility, which is about inclusion, equality, listening with attention to other people, respecting other people, even though they happen to be Muslim or gay or older or younger. An ethic of inclusion, which I think is a democratic ethic. It's not a left versus right ethic.
So what I wanted to ask you is how do you think about the idea that which started on the left, right? That making us uncomfortable is a bad thing. Now this is now used on the right in terms of teaching us, and so. I mean, I'm just wondering about would you allow for critical? So if somebody, for example, transgenderism, which a lot of people are actually very uncomfortable with, and they might ask questions that some people don't like to be asked, like should we include them in high school sports in a certain way? 80% of Americans have doubts about that, but there is a tendency then to say, you can't ask those questions. We don't discuss it because it's actually an existential threat to us. And I think that goes too far because it actually kind of, it doesn't allow inclusive discussion in some sense.
Right. So just my own response, but your response as a person who's been a university leader, a chancellor, my response is that open and free discussion of even difficult topics is a part of a university environment. Yes. However, I think I can draw a pretty clear line around hate speech. And so when is it Richard Spencer, the famous right-wing provocateur, these people are not interested in stimulating dialogue. They're interested in insulting Black people, gay people, people who fall outside of their definition of what is a human being. And from my point of view, frankly, unlike Elon Musk, I'm not a free speech absolutist. I'm making a joke here. Elon Musk is obviously not a free speech absolutist either. But I think finding ways of keeping Richard Spencer's off of campus is a good thing. It's just provocative, hate-inducing diatribes, and there's no place for it on a campus. But that doesn't mean there's no place for discussions of, even of Richard Herrnstein. I draw a distinction between Herrnstein and Spencer. Herrnstein is making an argument. It's an empirical argument. It's not a very good argument. I would argue against it myself. But there, I would feel like John Stuart Mill. More speech is better. And then don't try to prohibit, but in fact, speak up against and give reasons for rejecting. So that's what I think is the in-between position, which is a democratic position. So, it is about tolerance and inclusion.
But then you should like Kant and Adam Smith and the Impartial Spectator.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent point also, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I have no brief against Kant or Smith or John Stuart Mill, except the claim that they represent universal ethics, that there is a universal, logical, rational argument that demonstrates that Kantian ethics is true ethics and utilitarianism is for that reason incorrect. In this way, I'm much more attracted to Rawls and his idea of reflective equilibrium, where our judgments, take the high school transgender question, if we have some, let's say someone has some what does he call them? Kind of concrete judgments about particular instances, then that question of how to adjust principled views and the specific considered judgments, I think that is the nature of moral progress, moral discussion and debate and moving forward. It's, you know, there are ways in which I hope that conversation will come out favoring equality, but exactly what equality means is not so clear. I don't really know enough about the biology, but if a guy was a super duper Mark Spitz kind of swimmer and then becomes a female by definition and wins every swimming race, well, it doesn't seem fair to female swimmers. That's just kind of an observation. I don't know if I can justify it, and go ahead, pile up on me, but that kind of conversation leading to a refinement of moral ideas, that is what I'm kind of advocating for.
So we have there's still the comment of Matt, and there is one question by Nigel. So perhaps Nigel first, and Matt, then you give your comment.
And I'd be happy just to say, I don't actually have comments for Dan. Dan, I really appreciate your book. I read it in November, but I don't have extensive comments to make.
Thanks.
So Nigel, then.
Oh, thank you. I think it's been a really brilliant discussion. And I love the way it's focused on just the really big question of all, which is, as most of the commentators have brought out and have tried to grapple with, what are we to learn from history, from the history of the Holocaust, from the history of the horrors? I think it's a very profound question. I think I'm actually on Paul's side on this. My glass is worryingly perhaps even less full than 3/4 empty, and I think I may sound more Paul than Paul himself. But so I begin my course on the Holocaust and genocide each year with precisely this question: what do you think? What might we expect to learn from studying the Holocaust? And I go through some, fairly obvious possible answers that suggest themselves. And I point out to the students as a kind of spoiler alert that actually, I think that most of these, perhaps even all of the fairly easily stated possible and important lessons to learn are actually rather facile and trivial ideas in terms of this is what we might learn from studying the Holocaust. What we might actually learn, I don't think I have a very clear answer to either, but the question really is very important. The one thing that came to me when I think when listening to Dan's really interesting exposition of the key ideas and themes of his book, it reminded me of one of the most challenging and disturbing thoughts in a very general way on the phenomena of the Holocaust. And that's in a very small chapter by George Steiner, the literary critic. I don't know if any of the rest of you are familiar with this. It's called To Civilize Our Gentlemen. Okay, it's in a collection of essays called Language and Silence. And in this chapter, Steiner raises the question of, he points out, it's a common assumption, seems like an obvious assumption, that learning great literature is at the foundation of a humane kind of liberal arts education. And he then quickly moves on to say, actually, quite the opposite, worryingly, may be the case, because if you, and this point has been previously made by various commentators today, I think, that, or actually it was probably Paul, I think, that right across or down the hierarchy and network of perpetrators and administrators, well, at least of medium to higher levels, these people were highly educated and often precisely in the greatest works of literature. And Steiner worries that sensitivity, that openness to fictional humanity may actually have done the opposite of what we like to assume, may actually have been a facilitating mechanism for those people to do what they did. And that brought me to another thought, which occasionally troubles me at various points, usually when I'm doing my course with the undergraduates. And it's a kind of continuation, an extension, and perhaps a radicalization of Steiner's worry. And the worry is this, that it's all too easy, I fear, to read or listen to Dan's account or any of the other great works in history or social science or philosophy on these events, on these historical events. It's all too easy to sort of kind of think, yes, that's absolutely right. That sounds so reasonable. I completely agree with that. And so the worry is, and this applies, I think, most worryingly to, I find to when I reflect on my own works, and indeed the teaching of the course, which is that in a sense which can sound rather obscene, and perhaps it's important that it does sound obscene, I strongly suspect each of you get a strange pleasure from intellectually contemplating the ideas, the issues, the explanation, the histories that we do. And I don't say this in any kind of accusatory mode, or, well, actually I do, but I include myself in it. And it worries me that I find, let's just simplify it, let's call it an intellectual pleasure in my own thinking through and working out and coming up with ideas and theories and explanations that give me some satisfaction as being, to some degree adequate to the phenomena that I'm trying to explain. And I have the same kind of sort of satisfaction and intellectual pleasure from reading, assimilating, and seeming to understand and to see the insights and the blind spots, etc., as it seems to me in the works of other scholars that I read and think about and discuss with the students. And so, so the worry is that it's all too easy to get caught up in what is essentially an intellectual exercise of the same kind of phenomenon as I think what Steiner was getting at in, shall we say, the literary imagination of those people that were Holocaust perpetrators, and of course civilized people everywhere. So the worry is that I really don't know how in literal and practical terms we are to move on to do something with the history. I mean, Hegel's seemingly flippant aphorism, well, the one thing that we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history, just seems to be all too true. And this is partly a question, partly a confession. I really don't know what to do about that.
Paul, you have a comment, question?
Well, could I make a little bit of a response so it doesn't get completely forgotten? No, it's not all about, and I'm not talking about myself, and I know you're not talking about yourself. It's not all about intellectual puzzles and pleasures. It's about wanting to change the world. I think of Yevtushenko on Babi Yar.
Yeah.
And I think of George Orwell on The Road to Wigan Pier. In both cases, literary creators who wanted to express a human experience in a way that would change people, that the reader would understand a pogrom differently. He would understand Babi Yar differently as a result of that poem. Likewise with Orwell. ordinary upper middle upper class people of his generation did not understand being a coal mine worker, 35% unemployment, living in hovels. No, they didn't understand that because they had no direct personal experience. That's why the road to Wigan Pier was so important. So in other words, I guess what I'm getting at is this is important work that these people have done. You're right that Nazis were well read, many of them. That comes out in Grossman's Life and Fate, actually. But they weren't transformed by what they read. They weren't morally transformed. So, you know, what does that show? It shows don't be a Nazi, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to add a little bit to what Nigel just said. You know, Raphael translated an essay I wrote. I thought I'd cleverly given it this title, Hearts of Darkness, to echo Conrad, right, who strangely hasn't, you know, and the one disagreement Raphael and I had was he just told me hearts doesn't translate into French, which of course was crushing to me, since, you know, the intention was to emphasize, well, you know, what I took, of course, implicit or explicit in Conrad's novella was as you strip away the constraints of situation of civilization, watch what emerges. But apropos of the Steiner case, and just for what it's worth, supplement that, Rorty's Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, one of the works of literature he discusses is Nabokov's Lolita, right? And you know, he offers this reading where he points out that Humbert, right, the murderer and child molester in the book, is an aesthete. I mean, he, you know, and it just, right, morally underlines that education and appreciation of the finer things in life can go one way, and moral sensibilities the other. And the idea that there's some profound connection between education and moral decency, I say with a tear in my eye, is just unsubstantiated.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, obviously, I very much. I mean, yeah. I take no perverted pleasure in you know, in this recognition, if it is a recognition of an important truth. There's one other reference, another potentially self-advertising one that I think points away to the right kind of stance to take, and that is both the title and the content of Peter Winch's famous article on the Azande. I mean, the title is absolutely fascinating. Sorry, it's not the title. It's a sentence very near to the beginning in the introduction to the article, and that sentence is Winch says what he's trying to do is to get clear on the concept of learning from the study of, as they were then called, a primitive society. I mean, I think it's a fascinating, tortuous grammar, that phrase, and I shamelessly adapted that idea for the title of one of my early writings on the Holocaust, which I called The Concept of Learning from the Study of the Holocaust. And I think to use another metaphor, that is the heart of the matter. It's one thing to, so I mean, the content of Winch's philosophical exploration of that classic but by its own times quite enlightened British anthropology, the anthropology of the Zande conducted by E. Evans Pritchard. I mean, you'll recall that Winch is quite happy to celebrate the insightfulness and the accuracy of the ethnographical account of what that society is about, what it's like to live in that society, what they take to be important, what their belief system and value system is. Winch thinks that Evans Pritchard does as good a job as anybody could of seeking to make the bafflingly alien and unfamiliar clear or surveyable to the Western reader. But Winch's argument is that what goes wrong in that kind of anthropological account is a lack of reflection or awareness on what is the point of that anthropological insight and understanding in the first place. What is it why are we interested in understanding the Azande? And again, or people like the Azande. And again, as with the Holocaust, it's fairly easy to come up with some pretty obvious answers to that question as to why we might be interested, what we might want to learn. Winch thinks that those responses are a combination of the trivial and the unvirtuous. And of course, he goes on to set out what he takes to be absolutely crucial to the whole point and purpose of an anthropological account, which I think is similar to an historical account of some state of affairs. The key issue must be, Winch points out, that fundamentally the point of seeking to understand something very alien and unfamiliar is to find out things about ourselves that we don't get, that perhaps we're not even aware of being an issue, but which are actually of central importance. So that, I think, is a good, and I think that much of what's been said today, has been a really interesting way of thinking about and tackling this very question. What is the concept of learning from the history of the Holocaust?
Thank you. Steve, you wanted to say something? I mean, you need to turn on your microphone. We don't hear you.
Sorry, I wanted to say a million things, but I don't know if it's getting so late in the discussion. I mean, Nigel's just raised such a set of interesting questions. I mean, I think that, I don't know how Winch helps us here, really. I mean, you can only understand what's truly alien by making the unfamiliar in some way familiar. But it's true that, I mean, I think just going back to what Dan is arguing, I think philosophers have been very restricted in one major way, in which it's not just that they haven't confronted, or, well, some of course have, but mostly not, the evil of the horrific 20th century. But also they've been profoundly uninterested in social sciences, sociology, and anthropology, with some significant exceptions, such as Alistair McIntyre and some others, Owen Flanagan. But for the most part, philosophers have not expressed an interest in moralities, in different moral systems or moral points of view. In fact, I think it's a kind of built-in assumption of philosophy, certainly of analytic philosophy, that the question is, what is the right way to think about morality? Morality is a singular term, not a plural one. Anthropologists write about moralities. Philosophers don't, any more than they write about knowledges. So for me, I look at this thing a little bit differently from Dan. I think that what philosophers, almost as a profession, are not interested in is examining alternative moral frameworks, moral points of view. It's always the moral point of view. So that someone referred before to that speech by Himmler in 1943, I mean, the Nazis, even the Nazis had a moral point of view. Of course, this takes us into the whole question of, well, how are we going to define moral? But so let's not do that. But I think philosophy has this limitation, which Dan didn't focus on, but it seems to me of great importance, that philosophy is somehow professionally self-protecting from the basic anthropological thought that there are alternative moral points of view. There's a lot more to say, but that's just my contribution for the moment.
I do want to jump in here and thank Nigel, and my prod to Stephen was, right, where's Brian Wilson when we need him? I mean, the debates about rationality, is that famous anthology, was my entry point, what hooked me into this whole subject in the first place. And I certainly think Understanding of Primitive Society is aged well, shall we say. It's, you know, whatever you think about it, it's a great essay. But let me just, apropos Stephen's last point, and maybe pass this over to Dan for a reaction. Stephen's point brings forcefully to my mind, anyway, someone conspicuous by his absence here is Alistair McIntyre.
Right.
Maybe the only person I can think of off the top who's written on, philosophically anyway, who's written on exactly the topic that Stephen brings up, namely how you look at or assess different moral systems and their comparative. Of course, you don't have to agree with McIntyre, but he's not shied away from the big questions and right. Precisely the questions that Stephen brings up.
I know this is very late in the day, but I got one question I want to ask Dan. Dan says that philosophers have made the assumption of rationality and benevolence, and you put the two words together. Rational benevolence, you think, is somehow an assumption that philosophers have made. And I want to know, do you continue to think that, I mean, first of all, do you think that's true of philosophy today? Is it your view that that still has to be the assumption that the presupposition that philosophers must make?
So I would, it's a qualified point that I make, and certainly there are philosophers who do not assume either rationality or benevolence, but the tradition, maybe it's the tradition that I was educated in, especially the social contract tradition in social political philosophy, really including Hobbes, with the idea that the purpose of social political philosophy is to figure out a set of rules which will allow a group of rational individuals to live in relative harmony and peace. And then Locke adding a qualified kind of benevolence, that individuals are not specifically interested in defeating each other, though they are interested in defending their interests and rights. That line of thought, political philosophy, not including Machiavelli, but including an awful lot of modern political philosophy through the social contract tradition anyway, does, I think, make the assumption, and they're two separate assumptions. One is rationality and the other is a relative benevolence, a willingness to consider that the good of society as a whole, the good of other individuals, is something worth taking into account. That's what I mean by benevolence. And I think that those are put forward as kind of quasi-empirical ideas, not philosophical ideas, that people are kind of rational and people do, other things being equal, give some credence to the value of other people's lives. Yeah, I do think that there's a very strong strand of that. I think it's in Aristotle and Plato as well. Not the equality assumption, but the rationality and some level of concern for the interests of the group as a whole. What's worrisome about that line of thought is that it so dramatically failed, both during the rise of communism and in the rise of Nazism. The benevolence and the rationality assumptions both were in different ways falsified. And philosophy, I think, needs to take some account of that.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I would add to say is that what philosophers need to do is to take seriously the fact, or the undoubted fact, that what counts as benevolence, what counts as taking, as you put it, the reality of other people's lives seriously, what counts as valuable, that is variable across cultures and across different societies.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think philosophy has fallen down. There's no interest, even among philosophers who say that this needs to be attended to. The distance of philosophers from examining that question seems to me very striking.
Mm-hmm. So one of the weird fault lines I think in the US especially, but maybe also in France, is the idea that there's a fundamental breach between Christianity and Islam. Yeah. And one of the things I've learned by spending a lot of time with my Islamic philosophy colleague is that that's really incorrect, that Islam has a huge amount in common with, not so much with Christianity, but with Western philosophy. To the degree that I now look at Islamic philosophy, 8th to 12th century is one of the important periods of development of Western philosophy. And so I guess kind of my reason for mentioning that is that in one sense, we've otherized Islam in the past 20 years with the bigotry which shows up in the United States, but also in Europe. And on the other hand, we've kind of not understood what a central role Islam played in the Western tradition of philosophy.
Mm. Yeah.
So maybe then you could wrap up with general comments and.
Okay, so it's really interesting to me. This has been a fantastic discussion and series of back and forths among you and us, and I feel so pleased that Raphael, you organized this and so many of you took part in it. So that's comment number one. Comment number two is well, you could put it in terms of the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have sought to understand the world. The point, however, is to change it. There's no doubt at all, for me, that the reason to confront the Holocaust, the Holodomor, the Armenian genocide, the rape of Nanjing, the Rwandan genocide, to confront any of these evils is to change the world. And so it's why I react viscerally and negatively to maybe to Paul's suggestion and Nigel's suggestion. What can you do? It's just human nature. We're going to get this kind of horrible stuff and live with it. No, we should not accept it and we should not live with it. And there is an alternative. The alternative is that we should strive in every way we can to be activists for progressive liberal democracy and a world culture of inclusion, acceptance, tolerance, not a word I like very much, but an openness to the values and ideas and specific characteristics of others. That worldview is not inevitable. It's not dictated by philosophy in any fundamental way, but it's a good position and it's worth fighting for. And the reality, more so today in 2023 than in 1953, is we have to fight for it. we have to fight for inclusion, equality, respect for others, or the authoritarian personality will dominate and we will lose the relatively benign conditions of democratic equality that we have in France, Germany today, United States, and some other countries. We can lose that struggle and we need not to. And one part of not losing it is to understand what role fascist states and totalitarian states played in the conduct of great atrocity, great evil in the 20th century. It's not the only part of the answer, but it is an important part of the answer. And several of you, I think both Nigel and Paul, expressed skepticism about moral change, but we've had tons of moral change in the United States in the past 50 years and 60 years. I see that now as a 74-year-old gentleman, rather elderly, again, according to my very good humored grandson. The moral change.
You're a young man, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you. It's marvelous to hear that from a peer. The change in young people and their attitudes towards sexuality and race, and I would say also to religion, though the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the United States is really frightening to me. My children are Jewish. My grandchildren are Hindu, Jewish, Lithuanian. It is horrifying to me. I had the experience of my grandson, the oldest one, the one who said, "You're rather elderly, you'll probably be in the grave soon," holding up his hand. So his mom is an Indian origin, American-born woman, but his hand is kind of brown. And at 6 years old, I was wearing a Martin Luther King t-shirt as I was putting him to bed when he was having a sleepover. And he said, as you see, it's an emotional subject for me. And it's kind of weird to be overcome. But he wanted to know why they killed Martin Luther King. And I tried to. It has never happened in the classroom, I'm glad to tell you. I tried to explain in a way that wasn't too scary for a 6-year-old. And then he held up his hand and he said, "I'm so glad the Jim Crow laws are gone because I would have been subject to them. I, a brown person." So poignant to me. Maybe it's not a bad way to end this seminar. It's not about reflection. It's not about, philosophical principles. It's about the lived world of our children and grandchildren. And we have to fight for that world of inclusion that we care about. Smile now.
Many thanks, and thank you for the great discussion, and see you soon. And take care. And let's fight.
Thank you, everyone. Just a
Thank you so
marvelous
much.
experience for me.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Great presentation, great discussion. I don't know how you do it, Raphael.
Thanks, Raphael. That's great.
Bye-bye, all.